Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So this is just a quick little intro and sort of a warning, I guess, and some context to what's being uploaded here. There was a debate on Twitter yesterday on the subject of no enemies to the right, which has sort of been made famous by the discussions between Charles Haywood, Rod Dreher, those over at IM 1776. And so yesterday there was a debate hosted on a Twitter space between Nate Fischer from New Founding, Charles Haywood, Neil Shenvi, or something along that. I don't remember his exact name off the top of my head, and Wokal Distance, hosted by Christopher Rufo. I listened to the whole thing. You can find it on Twitter. I will link it in the description. I didn't get a chance to speak in that question and answer period during the debate, despite getting brought up onto the space to speak. So I hosted a post-debate space sort of talking about it. You're going to hear it all in full, all 2.5 hours of it. Some of the discussion is good, some of it has some technical issues and some bugginess, and in fact even Wokal Distance showed up to offer his own opinion and takes on the issue, which I tried my best to be polite, even though I disagree with him. I thought he was being disingenuous with his idea that Saskatchewan was a good political model when the entire country of Canada has a population equal to the size of Texas, and Saskatchewan's got maybe a population as a province of a little over 1 million people, but neither here nor there. I hope that you enjoy listening to this Twitter space. You can just leave it on in the background, and I will make it downloadable and accessible on Substack and other places, but I hope you all enjoy, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, guys.
I don't know how much of what I just said earlier just got totally lost in the mic bit. No worries. But Meta, Jake, if you want to give your initial thoughts, let me know.
Yeah, unfortunately, I missed about half of it. It sounds like I missed some of the better parts. The thing that I thought was kind of frustrating about the whole discussion was, for example, with when Logan Hall asked his question about like Franco or some other leader like that, there seemed to be just kind of an assumption that like somebody like that is bad, just like right off the bat. And it's like, well, but we accept the lesser of two evils or whatever, rather than just saying that, it's actually good to oppose communists or leftist radicals, that sort of thing. So that was kind of frustrating. At least, and I could, from the parts that I missed, there could have been something else in there, but from what I heard.
Yeah, no, to me, I mean, I was there for the whole thing since the beginning. Yeah, I had to step in because of the wonderful Twitter spaces and how audio can sometimes mess with you. But, I mean, it felt as if, what year is it? Was really a big question that kind of got me just sort of asking this once again, because, years ago, if we go back to 2016, 2017, 2018, every time there's been sort of an iteration of a sort of anonymous dissident, back then it was alt-right 1.0, however you want to classify these things. It was particularly interesting to me because, we're debating the same issues. Who do we allow to speak? We've been moving the Overton window pretty far in this respect. I mean, the fact that you've had the words anti-white or talk about the Great Replacement, for example, illustrates that, if you allow these issues to get pushed, they're going to be discussed by people with capital, influence, and more media attention than my, pithy 20,000, Twitter followers do. And even then, right, where we can be shadow banned and etc. Most of those guys aren't. So it just seemed like we're talking about the idea that this is the thing that I like about Charles Haywood is that Charles acknowledges, no, the enemy's already inside the gates. The hour is nigh. They're sacrificing children to Moloch. You really do need to get your shit together and take care of the enemy. This is an existential crisis. And we're having sort of these discussions along the lines of, oh, well, what about these bad apples or whatever? And I understand that concern, but there are much larger issues here. I mean, this is the same thing when we're talking about the transgender, they called it like the transurrection. This happened in like Nashville, this happened in Oklahoma City, this happened in one other place. It's cool that you can do the transurrection little meme that you can get dabbed on there, but none of those people are going to get arrested. None of those people are going to be held in federal, detention centers with all sorts of problems. And so I think that, one has to really understand that if your fear about right-wing Nazis is so strong, maybe wake up and smell the coffee grounds that right-wing Nazis in America are nowhere near the levers of power, but people that want to mutilate your kids and not do a single thing about the southern border while they continuously take secret flights paid by the American taxpayer to some of the whitest states in America, to me that matters a little bit more. But again, that whole NETTR thing, this is where we're at.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, like to your point about like what year is it and what Haywood said, I mean, at the very latest, this conversation would have made sense to be having it like 20 years ago. Dang, sorry, I just blanked on what I was going to say. It'll come back to me here in a minute.
No worries. Gio, welcome to the space. If you want to get your thoughts in, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. That's my brain's fried. I did 2 hours of Benjamin Boyce today. I thought what was really interesting, and I see Indian Bronson's here. I want to thank personally my friend Indian Bronson for going after. Well, I mean, this is recorded. I can't Fed post too much. Going after a particular spokesman for a particular proxy nation. That was pretty ballsy. I wonder if this person will show up in this space. Wouldn't that be something? We're all on a list somewhere. But anyways, what I think was really interesting was the one question that I was, maybe trying to formulate something in another medium. But the one that Wokal brought up about truth and power, and how, like, are we going to engage? What exactly did Wokal say? Are we going to engage in a matter of truth or a matter of power? And, again, like, I mean, this is, traditionally not a right-wing point. This is very much like, a Foucauldian point that you really can't have one without the other, sort of truth without power. And I think even Athenian alluded to that, is that truth without power is not just impotent, but the way in which truth disseminates within a social body, lacking power, sort of goes nowhere. And I think this is really what comes up with a lot of like these classical liberal types, with a lot of people like Wokal, is that to divorce truth and power is not just a mistake, but also it's like this metaphysical. I wouldn't even say metaphysical, but because a lot of them are like fedora tippers, like James Lindsay. But I would say it's a form of like social sympathetic magic, where truth will win at the end, and there's a teleology attached to truth. No, yes, there is. As a Christian, you would say yes. There's a teleology attached to truth. There's an eschatology there, rather. But in terms of real world politics, that doesn't really work out, because, as we know, power informs what is true on the most fundamental of level, at least political and worldly truth. And I think that distinction that Wokal made, that is the problem, and I truly believe that is the discursive bridge or aporia by which you cannot cross between people who want to like seriously analyze what is going on and people like the IDW who just want to like proliferate discourse endlessly and have it go nowhere. And that is the real problem, is that when you see truth and power together, that is the key to unlock, at least on a contemporary level, like, contemporary politics. Maybe not politics in the ancient world so much, but even still. I think that was the crucial mistake. That I think this really gets to the heart of like this whole thing about no enemies to the right. The reason we're discussing this is because we're on a level of, not having any form of solid institutional power. And it becomes a matter in the absence of institutional power. It becomes a matter of self-regulation and policing. And it seems to be that, at least within the last 15 years, if not the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, there's been this problem on the political right. I mean, hey, if you really want to go at it, maybe the last 100 years, there's been, sorry, I'm slurring my words, but the last 100 years or so even, there has been this problem of, let's say, an heterodox or an outsider power having the ability to marshal and regulate and hone itself. That is always the sort of like Rosetta Stone key of the political, when it comes to real world power, and quibbling over the nature of, truth as opposed to power, rather than truth, or truth being the handmaiden of power. That is where a lot of these people will get it wrong. And that's that's my little spiel.
Meta, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Gio makes some extremely good points, right? Which is, I think, unfortunately, people get caught up in this thing, and maybe we call it like the second matrix, right? It's like, oh, sorry. We all like have broke free of this mainstream delusion, and we're looking for some sort of alternative. And instead, we define the alternative by living in opposition to the delusion, right? It's like, oh, we know the truth. We know what's really going on. Like, we see all this stuff that they're doing, and, that's great. And then, patting ourselves on the back, and, we really figured it out. And it's like, okay, well, it's great, but what comes next, right? And I think that this is the most important thing, as Gio's kind of pointing out. It's like, you need to go after power. And especially if you're starting with zero power, how do you even bootstrap your way, back into institutions, back into these things? I think, the boomer generation was caught very much asleep at the wheel. And, we don't have as much of an inroad. I think that there are a lot of people in the business world that are sympathetic, right? You have a lot of financial people, VCs and startups and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is, it's so easy if there are even the most, they step out of line even just a little bit, or signal something outside of what is acceptable. There's so much power among the ideological left that they can just immediately get kicked out. And so there needs to be this process of we can't think of this as being like a revolution or a shift or an immediate contagion. I think the process is a long-term process. And I think, it starts at a few different ways. One, it starts with every individual, anon, who kind of believes this stuff to make themselves strong, to go out, get a good job, become a healthy person who's, informed and smart. And then, ideally kind of start to network together. But people do need to get involved in business, right? This is one of the interesting things, is there's a lot of self-help information in our sphere around, lifting and eating and, reading philosophy. There isn't nearly as much around like business. How do you build a business? How do you connect? Like, capital is really difficult too, because finding VCs that will invest in you if you're not hitting your ESG score or whatever is difficult. And so really, I think that is the big hurdle. And because people see how difficult it is to kind of make that jump, there's a lot of people that are just kind of sitting, looking at that gap and talking about it and theorizing about it, but we don't have people who are kind of willing to do that. And that really needs to be the next focus, as Gio's saying. It's like, sure, truth is great, but it means nothing without the power that we need to harness, and that largely will be financial in nature.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, as much as there is the lift weights, sort of that right-wing equivalent, I think, of maybe touch grass or whatever. I mean, that's so vitally important. I mean, just by being healthy and well put together, you're already better than like 60% of the guys out there in the real world. Like, as long as you're the well-dressed, non-schlubby, well-spoken, well-read gentleman, like, you're already way ahead of the game. The reason why I like Nate and his project so much is that, you are connecting capital to people that will not fire you for simply saying, women are women and men are men, and anything in between is like a mentally ill freak. Like, you want someone to hire you in that, and I think that there needs to be a recognition of that kind of hierarchy that does come with people that are putting together actual meaningful projects. But before I get on a ramble here, Mr. Bronson, by all means, you're welcome to unmute yourself and speak. Welcome.
Hey, yeah, I'll police the Brahmin loquacity. Thank you, Gio, for those kind words. Look, I've spoken to Gio actually about this. Maybe I don't know if it'll be released. But look, the reality is that like most people are actually quite normal. Most people do not believe that Sarah Ashton Cirillo, his name is Michael. He's a guy in a dress, right? Most people do not believe in mass immigration being a good thing. Most people do not believe in anti-white hatred being acceptable, right? But the problem is really down to like, who holds the power to hold your life to account, right? Most people have a boss. most people have not just a direct supervisor and a boss, but they have this entire web of incentives above them that they answer to, that if they become less than useful to, they're gone, they're kicked out, they're fired, right? That's what cancellation comes from, right? It's the idea that, some show or some event or some speaker is, quote, canceled because they said something that isn't acceptable for the institution or channel or whatever that's hosting them. And that mechanism comes down to like, well, I'm the superordinate in this situation, and my subordinate has said something that offends the people that I'm subordinate to. And so if I don't disavow or cancel or destroy this person's life, or take, some amount of participation in marking them off as wrong, well, then by association, I'll look like I approve of these things. And I know that these things are unacceptable in my society. And it's like, what is that? How do you reverse that? Well, so there's a social scientist who's written about this. It's called a preference cascade. The guy in question is I forget. It's Timur Kuran. If you read Private Truths, Public Lies, people will falsify their preferences and give voice to ideas they don't believe in, and do all sorts of these like dishonest things to go along, to get along all the time. And being able to do that, on some level, it's like, oh wow, this is a very gay and fake, literally fake and gay courtesan game. I never want to do anything like that. I'll say what's true, even if it means like saying a slur or whatever. There's that perspective on it, but then my perspective, and maybe this is because I'm an old fag, and it's the wisdom of time, is like, actually a crucial skill is being able to behave, is being able to be genteel, to be a little polite, a little gallant, even when it's like maybe annoying. There have been many times, and I understand this is a recorded space, it's quasi-public, I have a quasi-public thing. Very often I've made allusions to the involvement, say, of Israel in the 9/11 attacks. Like, say every September 11th, posting lots and lots of information about this because I strongly suspect Israel was behind the 9/11 attacks, at least in part. And that's kind of an adventurous thing to do, and there's a little bit of a meme to it, but actually, as time goes on, like the space to talk about these issues is sort of developing. A really unhelpful thing happens when you do this, or when you post about any politically, important thing, where someone in the replies will be like, they'll use words for Jewish people that maybe, I'm a terms of service respecter now. They'll say some things, they'll make some allusions about different people's national character. And it's like, okay, now that you've had this sort of, barbaric yop, you've slapped your chest and you've said the thing, what do you think has actually happened? What's actually happened is that the audience for these ideas, people that could be convinced of maybe a different power structure, maybe a different way to live, maybe, different public truths to hold on to, they're now in this really uncomfortable position where any association with these ideas, it like carries personal risks. And this keeps happening on the right. And if you point this out, people will be like, well, to not name them, or to not, do this and that or the other thing, that's cucking. You're an optics cuck, right? You care about the optics, not the truth. And the reality is that like 99% of people, they're still in this situation where they have a boss, or they answer to other people, or they have this like tangled web of things that they're responsible to and that they don't have any power over. And like, you should actually just have sympathy for them. Because, it's more important that the material conditions of life change, than like you make the funny joke, right? Like, not to put like too fine a point on it, and this will get like a little ethnocentrist, but like, bear with me. I've been genotyped. I'm like 30% step MBLA. My family is Brahmin. We're all professionals. We're well off. We're privileged. Like, all of this is true. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like I come from a population of people that have been like just crushing it from South Ukraine to North India for the last 5,000, 6,000 years. Like, we're going to be fine. Okay. Things get really bad here. It's like there's an India to return to. If you're from the Occident, if you consider yourself a Western man, you don't really have a homeland to go to other than this one, right? And so I think you need to be even more careful. You need to be even more genteel, more polite. It's like, you have this amazing chance with the internet, this amazing chance with broad skepticism of the overreach of liberalism that actually indicts the cores of liberalism, this thing that is poisoning your people, that is actually leading to decline. Why not use these tools and means and methods, this fragile social moment that exists, to subtly move things in the direction of change, to build those networks, to take some risks, and yeah, does that come with the possibility that maybe you'd get doxxed, and maybe the fake bullshit job that you got because you did you did the right things and posted the right things on LinkedIn, where you don't really respect your coworkers, but you're saving up for a 401k and a mortgage payment for your family. Does it come with all of this extra bullshit? Yeah, it absolutely does, right? But you're in a much better position to do everything from increase your race's TFR to build the institutions of power that compete with the incumbent ones if you just kind of don't you don't chimp out so much. This is I don't want to be the fun police, the online right, since 2013 now. I think the online right has been basically the most culturally dynamic, hilarious, insightful, frankly, historically well-read space, in the world. But there's got to be more, right? There actually has to be way more. And partly this will involve some degree of optics cucking. That maybe sucks, but it actually will, right? Look, Bap, Bap and I argue all the time. He'll be like, yes, hello, you are Brown Pajit. And I will be like, you're a homosexual with AIDS, right? Because we disagree about the Trump question. I still bought his book published under his own real name, and he's publishing with his face, right? And why is he doing that? He's doing that because ultimately it's more important for him to be involved within conservative institutions that exist in a way that cannot be denied, rather than just posting on Twitter as an anon, right? That kind of real world action, real world risk, and he does take real world risks, is really important. And it's not that everyone needs to be a player on the stage, but you do have to move past posting at some point. And then the posting does have to move past provocation at some point. And so, yeah, there will be a little bit of optics cucking. That's all I wanted to say on that. God bless. I fully endorse total Nissan dealerships. Take care, everyone.
Indian. Well, making me.
We'll get to that, and Geo, we'll get to the fun police question in a second here. I mean, it's funny. It is one face, I don't know what I'm saying. It's one face fag to another. I certainly don't have a problem understanding the power of, finessing things in an appropriate way. And so, as he sort of leads off there, but I'll respond. It's not like I'm going to be Martin here telling you to get strapped to a cannon or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think that the important thing to consider is that. Yeah, there are going to be ways that are going to be finessed. And it's rather funny. I was on listening to Night Owls just the other day, and I was listening to someone had linked Nightmare Vision, the old Thermidor magazine thing, right after Charlottesville. And it was a weird blast from the past, because they were talking about the same issues over optics, about how are you perceived by normal people, and, it's Cantbot, and we're talking. It was just I know, we're dropping old hat names here, fellas. And it's just they're talking about, well, my father is someone who doesn't know really anything about this. And then after that event, you're well, who the hell are these guys? Why were they doing that? Why do they have all these flags, etc.? And you do want to have well-adjusted, either small business people or just people that are going to, predominantly be okay with whatever social program you're advocating for. And that was a discussion or a point that got touched on in the No Enemies to the Right, the NETTR debate. Was you want to posit a positive vision to these people, because again, most people don't want mass immigration. Most people do not want a tax code system that is absolutely destructive towards having a class or having a business class or having the opportunity to inherit your father's business or estate and be successful. Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that everyone sort of shits on BAP for in a lot of ways, is that, he'll talk about, rather than naming them, we're going to talk about John Murray Cudahy's ordeal as a villain. We're going to talk about how these individuals react. I mean, like, John J. Mearsheimer, for example, wrote rather famously like the Israel Lobby, and John J. Mearsheimer thought that income inequality was the greatest national security threat in 2016 and 2020. He was like pro-Bernie both times. So, the most staunch international relations realist who gets hated by everyone for being allegedly a Russian shill, that's what he thought. So but he's not here, so what the fuck's the point anyways? But, these sort of debates, these sort of questions, you have to wonder who can you have to support you? And this is, again, why I'm a big supporter of Nate's project. I've met Nate IRL. I like what he's doing. I'm a fan of it. And so the idea that we're going to have, venture capital, we're going to have funds, we're going to have people that genuinely believe that America should not be a third world shithole, work with people that might hire you who also doesn't want the country to be a third world shithole. Accumulation of power, capital, and the resources and manpower to do so is necessary. I work in my local GOP where I'm at. I live in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, so it's probably a little different than, say, someone living in Miami or Palo Alto or Washington, D.C. or Dallas. But you want those kind of people to do so. And there's quite a few people that have requested to speak, but Meta, you go first. I want to add people as they come on in.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly to kind of jump off what Ivy was saying, like I completely agree. I think that this desire, again, it's unfortunately there's this kind of LARP element to the space where people are like, oh, I want to be, the most bombastic. I want to be the most spicy on the timeline, right? Like I want to like just trumpet and shout the truth. And it's like, look, you're not. Like, sure, you can do that, and there's people who are going to appreciate that and have it'll be a good time, but that doesn't move the needle forward, right? And I think like that's really the conversation that we're having here is like, okay, cool, like this has been fun and interesting, and it's nice to meet other people who are kind of in the same kind of thought space, but how do we actually move this forward? Because if you look at the board, right, the scoreboard, like we're not doing that well, and to me, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do that, but it really does, to his point, it comes down to messaging and being okay with like, hey, look, we don't need everyone who believes what we believe. It doesn't have to be this exclusive club of like all the smart people kind of, we're the smart people who get it, right? We need to figure out how do we get this messaging out to other people, like the boomer generation, right? They're not going to be into the, total Nissan dealership, mindset. They're going to be much more into, how do I keep my grandchildren from, hurting themselves irrevocably and, all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's a much like healthier approach to this that we really need to think about and to take if we're going to be successful in the long run. And part of that is thinking long term as well, right? I think that's another big kind of thing is like a lot of people want to see stuff happen now, and I think the mindset needs to shift to more of an understanding that this is going to happen over the course of years. I also think a big strategy here is I'm a big proponent of parallel movements, right? Creating alternative structures. So, for example, with education, having homeschooling curriculums that are shared, or trying to get small schools started in communities, people moving to locations where things can be done at a local level, right? Like we can't always think like, oh, we're just going to elect Trump and then Trump's going to fix everything, right? It's got to be more of like what can we do that's kind of a small movements of the needle are going to add up, and we don't need to be aggressive on every stand. So that's kind of my thoughts there.
Jake, before I let you come on in, Michael, if you want to speak, by all means, go for it.
Out of the foundational space that this space is in response to, and it's nice to be. I feel like this space is like that I'm in now is like a tertiary ring of response to that initial space. So I there's like a certain degree of esoteric. Friend-enemy distinction. Everything that Wokal and Neil are our enemies. A fellow Neil who's like halfway there, I feel like Athenian came on, Prodigal came on, these people are our friends of loyalty. So if you re-listen to that space after listening to what happens here, just please contextualize everything you hear from the fella.
Michael, you've been breaking up really bad. Don't know if it's your internet connection or not, but you might want to try to come out and come back in.
But I'm going to keep on going because there's like a.
Michael, you've been like roboting for a little bit. Both Meta and I can't hear you at all. If you want to try coming out, come in.
Oh, did I lose you?
No, it's just you've been all roboty this entire time. I'm only getting every other word from you. I can relate, Michael. Trust me, I live out in the sticks too.
Read Saint Bernard and Two Swords, which is a medieval Catholic discernment on the differentiation between temporal powers and ecclesiastical powers, and which combats that type of evangelical thrust we heard from the previous speakers in the space. Temporal powers deserve certain types of tactics and strategy, where ecclesiastical, those powers that are concerned with dogma, morality, and other things, deserve other types of authority. And so understanding the differentiation between two swords, Saint Bernard, right? So orders and giving Caesar his due, and ecclesiastical orders and sacraments, dogma. Not enough there. Differentiate between principles, strategy, and tactics. I think.
Well, I appreciate that. So, I mean, for those, if everyone wants to get the chance to listen to to take up that reading, I highly recommend it. I mean, both Western and Eastern churches have, different views, but also sort of recognize the understanding of ecclesiastical order as well as the earthly sort of political orders that we have to deal with in this time. Jake, if you wanted to chime in there, and then I'm going to add some people.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to have to go in a second, so I'll just give my quick thoughts. I don't really disagree with what anybody said here. Even what Indian Bronson was saying, like, he's right that if you want to be involved in politics, if you want to be involved in business, if you want to get involved with New Founding or Nate Fischer, any of this stuff, you need to be aware of your optics. You need to be, you need to act a certain way. You can't be spouting off on Twitter about, you can't be spurging, basically. But to bring it back around to NETTR, like the debate that was happening, I think that what we have to understand is that, like, what Wokal Distance and James Lindsay and these people want us to do, they want us tied in this like constant, basically purity spiral, but not purity spiral for our own beliefs, but purity spiraling for the approval of moderates or liberals or sensible society, whatever they would call it. So I think it's just important to, like, how we should think about it is, like, I don't feel any need to police or comment on the tone of anybody who is not associated with me. If I'm associated with somebody, then the way that they act or something, like if they start acting like a spurg publicly, then I might disassociate from them. But I'm not going to try to tone police a wignat on Twitter who's talking about verboten topics, because that guy's like not on my side. Even if we have certain shared goals or something like that, I'm not like, he's not on my side. He's not on my team. I'm not associating with him in the same way that I wouldn't like try to police what Wokal Distance is saying, because he's not on my side either. And I think that on the other side of that coin, we just have to be aware that like the people who want us doing this are simply not on our side. We're not debating people who, it's not a good faith debate on half of the parties involved in this are not debating in good faith. Even if they think they are, it's just not, we're not on the same side here. So that's kind of my take on the whole NETTR thing. But thank you for having me on. I got to bounce for now, but I'll definitely be listening in the background.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Jake, and your feedback's always greatly appreciated. I do think that's a vitally important thing. It's just that debate at the end of the day was, to some extent, people just speaking past one another. And it's funny, I'm going to add one of my favorite people that I respect on here to come on and give his thoughts, because he already has experience debating the subject. Mr. Dave Green, if you want to give your thoughts and speak away. You've already had this NETTR debate before.
I just got off the treadmill, so I apologize if I'm out of breath. I didn't catch the entire debate, but it did seem to have sort of a framing problem. There seemed to be, I know the entire side that's against the whole NETTR principle never really acknowledges the reality of cancellation culture and how that performs in institutions and the fundamental asymmetry of that. And No Enemies to the Right is a reaction to the asymmetries in cancel culture. I mean, there are obvious asymmetries. I mean, this is no longer 2017. We know that cancellation always goes from left to right. This is the reality. One of, I guess I can call him a friend now that I met him in person, but a person, Johan Kurtz from Becoming Noble, said he thought we should rephrase No Enemies to the Right as being Don't Feed the Left. And that's really what this should be called. It should be called Don't Feed the Left. And specifically, the way you feed the left, the way you make it a performance in the way that Indian Bronson talked about, is you use the left's language. Because if you use the left's language and you're on social media, then you implicitly create a performance for the left to react to. And that's what the Accord affair was. It was a performance, and it was a big joke at the expense of everyone on the right. And the whole idea that this is born from necessary principle, I think there's a potential principled reason for firing Accord, but that was not what was at play inside that drama. And I know that because Accord was not the only person that got fired. There were subsequent firings. Our mutual friend, Prudentialist, I won't name him, but we all know him, right? Was also fired in this surrounding brouhaha. If you know this, if you were at the Sildings conference this year, there was a very heartfelt story in that dimension. There needs to be a reaction to the asymmetry politically of cancellation, which always comes from the left. And if people are going to fire people on principle for things like lying and misrepresenting their opinions, it has to be done quietly and not in the language of our mainstream adversaries. That's what will stop it from becoming a performance at our expense and for our enemies' benefit, feeding into the monster that is sort of progressive cancel culture. But that's basically my piece.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's always appreciated, and you do have the patience of a saint for dealing with people like Wokal and others like him. So thank you for being one of the better.
I really enjoy it. I thrive on conflict when I'm not losing my head. But all right, thanks a lot, Prudential. I'll comment. I won't comment on that last one, but yeah, it's been a running joke in my house.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to let Ham go, and then Kruptos. Ham, Mike is yours, good sir.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. Good evening. I think that it was very illustrative that Michael Carrillo found his way into that particular space, because if you don't know, before he became the spokestroon for Ukraine, what Mr. Carrillo did was he was a Democrat party operative that infiltrated Republican Party gatherings in Nevada. He tried to organize the Proud Boys to attend some sort of January 6th demonstration at the Nevada State House. He would attend Republican, events in the state. He even ran for city council as a Republican, and he informed his opposition, the woman who won the council seat, to the FBI. So this raises the question, just because someone says they're right wing does not mean that they are actually right wing. And it's not a question of punching right, it's a question of punching wrong, because there is subversion and infiltration by members of the left, on the right. I mean, think Ray Epps, think, the quote unquote right wing militia group that joined in with Governor Meg Whitmer to try to kidnap her. There has to be some sort of degree of purity control, but it has to be pragmatic. It cannot be just an ideological disagreement. I mean, this isn't a case of Nietzscheans versus trad cats or religious people. This is actual agents of the left that are intentionally infiltrating right-wing groups and trying to destroy it within. So I don't think it's a question of punching right in that instance. It's a question of punching wrong. And it's something that everyone needs to be cognizant of. Thank you very much for your time.
No, I absolutely agree with you there, Ham, because one of the things, like everyone in this side of the sort of like right-wing internet ecosystem knows is that there are like three things that you can be accused of, either in good faith or bad faith, that instantly is like just like the scarlet letter. Like either you're called the grifter, you're called like a subversive, usually they'll call you Jewish, or they'll call you a Fed. And it's like those three things, they're usually just like a really giant, like scarlet letter Mark Keynes type deal that just says, all right, you're bad, don't associate. And, and it's vital because, on one instance, we do live in a highly schizophrenic environment where we don't know who is being a bad actor who wants you to do things like go be the next Meg Whitmer kidnapping or whatever, or be like Ray Epps and tell you to go to storm the Capitol or whatever. Like those things definitely are vital and important. But for those trying to, and it was a big divide between like the more publicly facing individuals, like all five of the people that were the speakers, including the host, Chris Rufo. I mean, none of them are anonymous. None of them have done anything, as far as I know, anonymously. So you're like, we work in a very tertiary area wherein people, like they'll get ideas from us, and they'll listen to us to some extent, and they'll go from there. But I definitely understand where you're coming from, Ham. Like there is that environment that we have to be very mindful of, which is there. Gio, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, like to be fair, I mean, I guess people they accuse me, you, and Dave of that, certainly. But I think like the difference is that, when you, to use a wrestling term, when you've sort of like paid your dues in the online trenches, it's different. Now, I think like what, when Indian said, I mean, okay, listen, partially I'm afraid to release my interview with him, which is a very good interview, right? But he's been attacked from all sides. I mean, there's this huge left-way journalist that had this tweet about him or capped him. It was a good tweet, though. It was about the case where the two guys ran over that cop,
Yeah.
But he has a very bombastic way of putting things, put it that way. But anyways, I think that no, it is true that you can open up a lot of space for discussion by having not just like a question of optics, but I think even the question of how is it that we can find ways around like the truth regimes that are so dense and so opaque in terms of actually getting like subversive or dissonant ideas into sort of like the collective news sphere. That's always the question of, that's the whole point of like NETTR or whatever you want to call it. Because, when you live more or less in a siege mentality, you're going to have to like really think of this question of, normalizations of opinion. But also, what's interesting is that I think the difference is that like, from the perspective of people that have mainstream careers and journalist jobs and so forth, and yes, it can become a bit, what's the term I'm looking for? Like a little bit, incredulous, if you will. Not to say that, I would bracket Charles Haywood though. I think he's more or less a good faith actor. And I think that, his insights are important. But, that's the thing. I mean, that's just the problem, is that this goes back to the way in which we even think about like what we're doing, and the amalgamation of posters that have culminated in what people call the quote unquote right now. To think of it more as an avant-garde rather than a movement, it's clarifying, but at the same time there's always going to be limitations, in the absence of like an actual quote unquote political project, rather than a, you know sort of culture jamming aesthetic project that has largely made up the bricolage of like quote unquote e-right thought for the past 10 years or so. And I think like these questions are very important, but that's the thing, is like at the end of the day you have to realize that um I think even like Pap said it the best, like, we're already in the desert, we're already in the end times here. And any sort, like, for example, Han brought up this agent, like, this is a reality, right? Like, there's a huge demoralization ritual to have this like sort of theater kid performance of, we're gonna get every Russian propagandist, we're gonna gulag them in this like this very moralistic Marvel movie language. I mean, that is a part of the way in which quote unquote normal people think about politics. And it's very disheartening in a way, because that actually does work on people. The Hollywoodization of discourse actually does work on people. And certainly Davis talked about this, and that's a huge, that's a huge problem. That's what we're dealing with. And like this is like the very baseline level of opinion and discourse that we have to contend with in terms of a mass political movement. And so these are things you have to like keep in mind to have a realistic perspective on things. But I'm just rambling right now.
No, I do think that that's important to keep in mind. It's like, this is the reality that we live in, and that we already live in a world where it does not matter, not to get ecumenical here, but like we live in a world where NPR has done a lovely hit piece on, say, like the Eastern Orthodox in the country, the Atlantic and sort of the David Frum types have done more articles than I care to count on evangelicals and mainline Protestants. We've already seen what's happened with the LCMS in the case of Brian Turnipseed, who is a good friend of many of us in this space right now. And then, of course, we have the FBI in Richmond. Their whole office has been investigating traditional Catholics, even those that go to like Novus Ordo masses, not just the TLM crowd. And so, like, this is the reality that we live in. And so, yeah, there's going to be important epistemic frames to adopt. Like, do you want to reform the system? Are you trying to survive? What are you trying to do? And that was something that the debate had the issue of, was a lot of speaking past one another and spouting at moral authorities that your enemies don't recognize. And this goes back to what you and I were talking about, Gio, about the nature of truth and power. Is that, even if it's a lie and the emperor does have no clothes, if you're in charge, it's the truth that the emperor, he's wearing the most beautiful, suit made on earth. And that's just the nature of it. And that kind of goes back to the whole Yarvin issue of like, if you take over your pod people now. But again, it goes back to that sort of epistemic question that I feel like so much of that debate sort of spoke past one another. But Kruptos, you're on the air, good sir. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Prue. Yeah, it participating in the space was interesting. Now, and I'm forgetting the other gentleman's name, other than Wokal, but Neil, that's it. And yeah, he's very much emblematic of a certain type of, and I think sort of mainstream evangelical, especially big ministry leader, frontman type of position, in a sense of, and as I mentioned in the time that Chris gave, that one of the things that many in the Christian right want to do is they want to occupy the high road, but they're not really serious about winning. So they'd much rather be on the high road, and that's really one of the things that Alul, who was himself a Calvinist and Christian, very deeply Christian, noted, and he remarked that politics works by its own exigencies, that it is its own realm and in its own thing. And I think that the poor gentleman who was breaking up constantly tried to make that point, that there's a reason why the crown, or the magistrate, the king, and the church in that regard, the pastor, the priest, are separate in their roles is that each has a different task to do. And one of the things that is tasked to the magistrate, is in a sense punishing the evildoer. That's that passage, I think, it's Romans 13. And so, but there's a whole lot of other things. There's, protecting your people, and there's a whole range of activities, and these things that Elul notes that you have to do that are the lesser evil. So part of protecting a people is holding her secrets, and that means openly lying to your rivals and potentially your enemies, right? Well, nobody's approving of lying, but then, okay, should you need to share all your secrets with your neighbor then as well too? Because that would basically expose you to, you basically hand over all your advantage to your enemy to defeat you, right? So there's all of these kinds of realities that we get into, and Elul in his book Violence specifically, actually spends multiple pages calling out the American pro-life movement for its ineffectuality, because of its desire to be on the high road and its unwillingness to engage in the necessity of violence to solve the problem of abortion, quickly. In a sense, you take the lesser evil of, like blowing up abortion clinics, not necessarily killing, but do it in the middle of the night when nobody's there, but just basically sending a message that the cost is too high to open and run these things, and we're just going to keep the pressure on you until you stop, right? And he said, wars have started for less, but you can either do one of two things. You can either do the necessity of violence, or you can take the high road, right? And so he says in The Political Illusion that that a politics of ethics or a politics of religion is impossible. He says you can't do it. He says you will either be hypocritical or ineffectual, because the politics runs by its own set of rules. And that means you live in a world of necessity. Now, this is not the world that God intended it. It's not the world of grace, but it's a world, we don't live in the world to come yet. We live in a world that's sort of now, but not yet. And so we have faith in Christ. We know that, that our treasure is kept in heaven for us. But the world that we live in has to deal with a lot of very ugly realities. And so I explored in my pieces sort of, what was what, and eventually I came to the conclusion that a lot of what we're trying to do with this whole NETTR debate is, like good managers, develop a whole policy framework by which we can now devise sort of the rule of law for dealing with right-wing radicals, so to speak, that answers all the questions, pegs everybody rightly, and now we have a nice, clean, neat schema for who to reject and who to include. And that way it absolves us of the moral responsibility. But there's a lot of situations in Scripture that it isn't policy-based. It's more, the king is meant to be a wise leader, and that means you're making a decision in which every decision there isn't a clear answer. Like that example I used in Proverbs, answering the fool, don't answer the fool, right? Well, do you accept the racist or don't accept the racist, and it will probably vary from situation to situation. So then you are looking to invest it in people. Well, our managerial system was specifically designed to prevent the vagaries of different people from having an effect. That's why we want policy, because we don't want to necessarily, well, what if you have a bad ruler? Well, at least we got good policies. Well, in this sense, if you're going to battle the regime, in a sense, can you battle managerialism with more managerialism? Because that's really what the NETTR policy wants to do. So then really your alternative is to invest it in people, men of quality, action, wisdom, whom you can trust to make those decisions, to say, well, here's a rabid dog that we need to keep on a leash. In polite days, maybe we wouldn't, but we need him right now, and there was an argument. I mean, in one of the pieces, like one of the comments have been made, say, about American generals, is that they have been great managers, and they run great logistics and all of the stuff of war, but there are none to a handful, maybe one or two tactical geniuses in the history of American generalship. Robert E. Lee is one, and maybe Patton. Right? And beyond that, the rest of the crew are mostly just bourgeois managers who are military men. And that was sort of the condemnation of the American, that you're not producing, the Rommels or the Guderians and these sorts of men, tactical flair and verve, You want, and I think those are the type of people that we need leading our movement, but who are at once godly but also tactically sound, and who can do the hard thing when it needs to be done. I think that probably encompasses pretty much everything I said in my pieces.
Well, no, I appreciate that. I mean, like from the Christian perspective, I mean, not only do you have to deal with, what is rendered unto Caesar in that respect, but also, I mean, like I think of Ephesians, I think it's 6:12. I put it out the other day. Like, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the rulers of darkness. I mean, we are to resist evil in that respect, and regardless of whether you're reformed or not, there's a long-standing tradition that goes back to apostolic and Christ's teaching about resisting evil in that respect, both spiritually and otherwise. And I think that that's important to consider here. But before we get on, Meta, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just really was enjoying what Kryptos was saying, and I think this actually touches very nicely on a tweet that I put together today that's talking about morality. I think it was Zero HP. It said something about, oh, you can't have a reason or a logic-based morality, right? And because I think a lot of times we have this misconception around morality that it's a set of rules, right? It's like, thou shalt not kill. That's a rule. Can't break that rule. But obviously, we can think of situations in which, it would be morally justified to, defend yourself, right? And maybe that necessitates, using lethal force in that situation. And so, how do we rectify that? How do we rectify having like some sort of morality? And the way that I would kind of explain this is, I think of morality more as kind of a strategy than a set of hard laws that one has to follow. The analogy that I use in the tweet is, if you're playing Magic the Gathering, and there's probably enough nerds in the space that they'll get this analogy of Magic the Gathering. It's a card game, but I'll keep it very basic. When they come out with a set, you build a deck out of the cards in that set, and you can think of the decks that you could build as rock, paper, scissors. And so in each set, there are certain archetypes that are going to be stronger just inherently because, the rock archetype just has the best cards. And so in a vacuum, rock is definitely the best deck to play. But when you go to a tournament, if everyone's playing rock, it makes a lot of sense for you to play the paper deck. And so you can say that there is a strategy, a philosophy, an approach to playing Magic the Gathering well, but it's not in a vacuum. It's played inside the metagame. And I think the same can be said for morality. It's like, yes, it's great to have this high idealistic morality of kindness and love and tolerance and empathy. I absolutely get that. But that is the morality, or that is the approach that is best applied when you are in a metagame where other people are playing similarly, when other people are also kind of in this cooperation, empathy, love mode. When you are in a low trust society that we are now, where that empathy, where that love, where that caring is being taken advantage of, then you are putting yourself in a really bad situation where other people can take advantage of you. And so it doesn't make sense from a moral standpoint, right, to be like, oh, I'm going to love this person who's attacking me or invading my country or wants to kill me and replace my children or neuter my children. Like, at that point, even from a moral standpoint, right? Because, and again, I think this stems from our idea of morality being this very rigid or only kind things being moral. We don't think of, going to these kind of more kind of typically thought of as, evil or amoral actions, because we see them as just so inherently immoral. But it really needs to be considered in the context. And that's what I'd say, it would seem like Kryptos was getting at there, which is that we're kind of in a situation where we want to be the better people, but if we hold fast to that kind of morality, we're going to get run over by those who would take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I mean, for context for those listening, I mean, like, Kryptos is a reformed minister, pastor of the neo-Calvinist tradition. Meta, I know that you have a much different view on religion than us Christians do. I just feel like it's sort of an important distinct. Wokal, I see that you're in here. I will add you in just a quick minute, but Mr. 8th century wood chipper, my friend, go ahead and get your thoughts in, and then I guess I'll bring Wokal on after that.
Yeah, thanks, Prude, for having me on. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, everyone, I can hear you just fine.
Sweet. Yeah, I didn't get to catch the beginning of this space. I only got to hear about half of the main NETTR debate. But I think it was really interesting and telling. You know, someone brought up Franco inevitably, and I honestly the Spanish Civil War is a good context to at least think through these issues. That, I mean, you have all of these factions on the right in Spain that are very, very different. Whether you're talking the Phalangists or the more moderate monarchists and so forth, and they all have the same goal of defeating their enemy. And I mean, today, I think it's just, I mean, listening to so much of it, Neil, I mean, some of the guys here brought up Neil, where like listening to the arguments that were made by Neil and Wokal were difficult, because the entire time in the background, you have this monstrous regime, which, I mean, has done so much evil and plans to do so much worse. And yet we're talking about, oh, we got to be really careful about letting certain people in because they have diseased minds, and that would be bad. And it's like they want to kill us, right? These people are totally evil, right? They rig elections, they kill, they kill people, they do so many. We don't have to get into every single thing they do. I mean, it's just it's insane. They're flooding the country with millions of foreigners. I mean, all of it, and people seriously are saying, oh, there might be some bad people. We got to police the ranks, when the right in America has been doing that for 60 years, where they purge anyone slightly to the right of someone like Bill Kristol, since World War II, but especially in the last 50 or 60 years. It's insane that conversation even happens. It's like, well, they might get into leadership, and it's like, well, okay, like what are we doing here? So I mean, that whole side of the debate was nuts. But the thing I really wanted to talk about, and it got mentioned earlier, is like, why is this guy, this Cirillo guy, in the space? Like, what's the point of that? Somebody brought it up, but why is that person there listening? I mean, beyond the obvious.
Opposition research, probably. Yeah.
I mean, maybe you're right, Gio, but I mean, even beyond that, is it to scare us, right? Is it to say, I mean, because it's public, like that guy could have gone on a burner account, nobody would know that he's in there, right? I think it's even deeper than that. It's to say, okay, you people are on our radar, and we want you to be scared of saying anything out loud that might be right wing, and nobody in there is saying anything like, oh, we should like have violence or do criminal activity, but nevertheless, that doesn't obviously matter anymore. So I mean, do you guys think that these people show up in these spaces to put pressure on us, to make us scared?
Well, yeah, I'm sure there's a myriad of reasons. I mean, for definitely to intimidate, but also like there are connections that man probably has that are well beyond anyone's, like, outside the APA research that was dumped earlier in this space. I think it's very concerning that an individual that is associated with the Ukrainian armed forces and is probably supported to some extent by my own government and probably the intelligence community. Yeah, these people are on their radar, and that's something to consider. I know that there are hands up, but there is a participant from the debate that wishes to speak. I don't know for how long he'd like to come on, but Mr. Distance, whenever you have the chance, if you want to offer your thoughts, maybe a post-debate thing here, I'm going to just be happy to let you on and give us your thoughts, your after-debate opinions, the like.
By the way, going by the Boniface option by our good friend here.
Gio, let him go, and then we can do some chilling at the end.
Hello. Thank you.
Hello.
So I have a couple of things I want to touch on. This didn't get brought up in the debate proper because the question was about no enemies to the right, and so there's a lot of side things about the Enlightenment that got brought up briefly. A lot of stuff that's off to the side, but I wanted to touch on this because I did think this was valuable. I want to touch on two things. One is the what time is it question, and the second is the question of feeding people to the regime. And I'll start with the first one, the second one first, and then I'll do the first one second. In terms of feeding people to the regime, I think there is a feeling on the right that because of the way that the media, the universities, we'll call it, to use Moldbug's term, the cathedral, the cultural space operates, the economic space operates, that if you punish somebody to the right, the media apparatus, the cancel culture apparatus that encompasses the entire culture and economic sphere is going to ground that person to powder. And I think part of what's motivating NETTR, and it didn't get explicitly stated, although Nate touched on it, is that you're essentially giving somebody the equivalent of a temporary or maybe long-standing social death penalty the moment you do that. And there's a feeling that unless they've done something really horrendous, that to throw even a single punch to the right is going to open somebody up to that kind of social destruction. And that's not something that I think, I don't want to take that lightly. I understand that I'm not a consequentialist when it comes to my ethics, but consequences are at least part of the equation. And I do think that there needs to be care taken when somebody is kind of moving forward on the right and holds something that I would consider to be on the same level as abortion or transgenderism or whatever it is. That kind of person needs to be called out. But I do think that you do need to take into account into the calculus of what is the left going to do if they decide to pick up this ball and run with it. And I don't think that's something that's unfounded. And so I want to acknowledge that, yeah, I get it, that if somebody punches right and that punch lands, the left might take that person up, and we might say that they deserve a slap on the wrist, but the left is going to turn that into the social death penalty. And I want to acknowledge that that is part of the equation, and that is something we need to think about. So I don't want to, how would you say, set that entirely aside. I don't want to do that. The second thing is that there's been this talk about we have to be strategic, we have to be strategic, we have to be strategic. And this is where I might draw a little more fire. I haven't seen a whole lot of strategy. So I live in the province of Saskatchewan, and I brought that up. And during the 90s and 2000s and 80s and 70s and all the way back to 1944, the far left NDP party won 13 out of the 17 elections. A Liberal Party won 2 elections, and the Conservatives won only 2 elections. So 2 out of 17. So for the better part of 60 years, 63 years, we were being ruled by leftists who just marched that province to the left in every conceivable way. And when the Sask Party, which was a locally grown party, some renegade, what would you call them? Fiscally responsible liberals broke away from the Liberal Party, and a group of conservatives formed the Sask Party. They took power and have been marching the province steadily to the right. For example, strip clubs are banned in the province of Saskatchewan. We just had the new Parental Rights Act was announced, and they're going to start removing some of the transgender ideology, and in fact all of it, from the schools. And they're going to invoke a Canadian anachronism called the Notwithstanding Clause, which allows Parliament to set aside the judgments of the courts in order to carry through with their policy in certain cases. The Sask Party, which is the party that I worked for many years, is exercising the very kind of power that many in this space would want to exercise. And let me tell you, they adopt my mentality. Those are very, very smart, strategic people, and they don't make peace with, they absolutely police their boundaries. They have not a problem cutting a candidate loose if you say something crazy, or if you say something outside, or if you even don't show proper message discipline. You can find yourself out of cabinet, out of caucus, or out of the party entirely. And what has happened as a result of this is we have 50 and 60 seat majorities in the province. We are able to do things like, banning strip clubs. We're able to say, when they bring the transgender stuff into the schools, we're able to say, okay, we're going to start taking that out. We have enough power in the province that we can invoke the notwithstanding clause and suffer the political consequences and still have a 40 or 50 seat majority. I am completely unclear, given that we have done this without having to do NETTR or anything else. And Saskatchewan, it's not like we don't have splinter groups, but we've been able to do this and to exercise the kinds of power that many in this space would want to chat. And we haven't had to do NETTR or talk about any of this Machiavellian whatever. We just follow what we think is the truth, and then we follow through on it. We say what we're going to do, and then we go out and do it. And we haven't had to do this. So I'm unclear about where all this strategic genius thinking, we're going to be like really Machiavellian and understanding the discourse and the power structures, and we understand how the regime works, and I'm just not seeing the success. Whereas the party that trained me, that I learned under, has been not only took back power from a leftist political juggernaut, but reduced it to ash, to the point where their best thinkers, their highest rated what would you call them, advisors and strategists, have basically been reduced to nothing. They leave the province because they can't get traction here. And so, the author of Beautiful Trouble is Dave Oswald Mitchell, who was the as I said in the space, the chief advisor to Ryan Miley. And he wrote the book Beautiful Trouble and put together all of the strategies that the left uses, partially in a response to the fact that he was getting his ass kicked so badly in Saskatchewan, just getting clobbered on every single issue over and over and over again. The leftist opposition in our province has been reduced to nothing. They have no power. They don't exercise anything. Everything is under the control, and is increasingly so, under the control of the political right. They have some school board attendees, but we'll be taking those out in the fall of 2024. Like, that'll be done. So I'm just wondering where all of this strategic genius is showing up, where all this strategic thinking that's so much better than what I'm offering, when the people who trained me, the people who taught me to think this way, are just routing the opposition. And so I want to say that, to kind of conclude here, is that the point of this is, people say, well, we have to get rid of rules. We have to get rid of, we don't know what we're doing. We have to do what we do when we come to a situation. I kind of think if you trade truth for power, you lose both. And if you don't have a set of principles that are gonna animate you, power takes over the whole house and corrupts you. And we're all susceptible to that. So I think that we can win, and in fact do win, when we police our borders appropriately, and when we make sure that the people who are on our side are the people who are right. I'm kind of Gideon at this point. If you can't drink the water correctly, you have to go home. So I guess that's where I'm at. But and I appreciate the opportunity to be heard out, and I'll pass the mic back to the Prudentialist here.
Well, thank you, Wokal. I appreciate. I'm not going to just outright silence anyone, even if I have my own disagreements with them. I'm not that kind of guy. So no, you're by all means given the opportunity to speak your words and your piece. I think one of the issues that did come out from the debate, maybe you weren't here at the beginning of the space, was that there did seem to be a lot of talking past each other, at least from an epistemic frame. And I think that also caused a lot of issues going back and forth. And it's also, I think, why a lot of the Enlightenment was brought up at the beginning by Charles. One of the things I think is also sort of important is scalability, as well as the models here. I do think that some people might raise some concerns when they look at Saskatchewan as a province. And I think with the population of that province is, it's maybe not as comparable to, say, trying to take over in the state of Texas or something of the like. I think that that's something to keep in mind in that respect. But I think what also was brought up in the debate with respects to, where would they border or who would they criticize? And I think that there was some nuance that got fleshed out there, which is why I was glad the discussion took place, is that I don't think, and we talked about this earlier in the space before you were there, was that, you do want people to be friendly to ideas that are going to go forward. As for the discussion of feeding enemies to the regime, I think a good example of this would be over in the United Kingdom. Dominic Cummings and Nigel Farage, whatever you may think of him and his politics, they had accomplished something great. They had accomplished what they believed to be more national sovereignty for their own native country rather than to be ruled by Brussels. Brexit had its own issues. Clearly, I don't think it's managed to succeed the way that they wanted it to. But not too long ago, he was debanked. And I think that, there were quite a few people of the Tories who were nominally conservative, nominally on the right, that had no problem or were rather silent on that issue. And I think that's something that has to come to my mind. I don't agree with you on a lot of things, Wokal, but I sure as hell would defend you if, say, Citibank or something wanted to, deplatform you. In the same way that someone further to my right, if that happened to them, I would defend them. I think that's a big nature of what NETTR comes into my mind is who are you willing to defend that you may disagree with on key issues.
Can I just add, I agree with you on that. And I think that when I was talking in the space, one of the things I tried to bring up is there's a difference between policing the boundaries of who gets to be in leadership, which I definitely agree with, and policing the boundaries of who's allowed to buy groceries.
Well, I mean, if one's debanked or don't have access to that, yeah, they're not going to be able to have a living. And even if there are people I disagree with, I want them to be able to live functionally. And that's
I agree.
That's a key issue here. And I think that's a big part of NETTR, because there are people that are further to the right of me, or even sometimes to the left, but agree with me on key issues that have been debanked or, been more or less depersoned or deplatformed that I would defend. And I think that that's egregious, because one day they'll come for them, but they'll come for me as well. And I think that you and I both know, Wokal, that the left is this sort of systematizing, homogenizing system that, the managers are going to come for all, whether I'm first on the list or last on the list. And that's the nature of that. But I do want to let some other people speak as well before we get there. Kruptos, you've had your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I guess, living north of the border too, I'm somewhat familiar with the Saskatchewan situation. And all things considered, having worked for the CPC myself, back when the merger happened, I've helped 5 or 6 candidates get elected in various ridings, and I understand what Wokal is saying. I think in some ways the politics where I'm at now in terms of understanding how the system works and the dynamics of what's going on, I wonder, it's good that we win elections, but the system itself is not a content neutral thing that we then now fill with, quote unquote conservatism. So we ask, talk about message discipline and what we can say. And I've been on the side of that kind of message discipline, where your candidates have to be told, well, don't talk about abortion, right? Don't talk about gay rights. Don't talk about homosexuality, right? So, you look in Saskatchewan, well, what does winning mean? Are we just sort of in a spectrum to
I think you cut out there.
Was that a question for me to answer? Or was that rhetorical?
I think he cut out. So I'm not too sure.
Well, I would just like to, if I could just pick up on what he just said there. I think I'm getting an echo in the room that I'm in. I apologize for that. Let me move to a different room.
Oh, you know what? My phone was ringing, I think, and I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. I apologize.
Yeah, no. So
go ahead.
Yeah, so in a sense of what does conservatism mean? And I'm going to have to bounce in a second too, because I'm going to have to call this person back. But what does conservatism mean? Are we playing within the realm of acceptable political discourse, like we're to the conservative end, or let's say the slow end of basically what is a liberal system, or are we doing like real conservatism? You know, and in a lot of times, like I've been in campaign meetings where we were told by the party hierarchy in a conservative movement, well, you can't talk about being pro-life or abortion because it's too divisive. And you're going like, well, at that point you're sitting there thinking like, okay, I know what our writing is. I know that like 90% of the people here are pro-life and they get it, but they want to hear us talk about it, but you're not allowed, right? So I know what party discipline is like, but then, you know, are you really a right-wing movement at that point? Are you just merely a right-wing party within the bounds of the current Overton window, or are we in a different place? And so I kind of appreciate what Wokal's saying that way, and there is a certain sense of winning within the system, but are we really willing to press the kind of conservative agenda that even a mainstream party with victory would, you know, risk their quote-unquote coalition, or do we self-censor just because having power is just for the sake of having power, and like, oh yeah, we're going to do tax cuts and better management and blah 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 blah, you know? And that's kind of the concern. And I know the Saskatchewan, they're bet. I'd rather have that than the NDP. Let's put it that way, you know. So I guess I'm going to have to unfortunately bounce. I won't be able to hear a response or reply that way because I'm in the middle of negotiating a fairly sizable deal, and now I've got to call somebody back and continue those negotiations. But again, thank you, Prue, for having me on, and we'll talk soon sometimes, I guess.
Yeah,
you too.
As a response to that, I would say, how do I phrase this? One of the things that our leader always taught us is that haste has been the downfall of the right. And what tends to happen is when the right finally, because we're so docile, we just kind of like want it to settle down, and then we just want to go back to our lives. We want to be left alone. And as the point has been made many times, the people who want to win always defeat the people who are wanting to be left alone. It's a real problem because the right very often just wants to be left alone. So when we do get politically active, it's almost like they want to fix the problem immediately rather than do a slow march over years. But I think that the Sask Party has done a very good job of doing a slow march over years. I mean, I don't know anywhere else in North America, or many places in North America, that you could just outright ban a strip club or completely ban strip clubs and then win, 65% of the vote, get 80% of the seats in the legislature. So I would say, I think you are kind of, it's not that you're playing within or with the bounds of the Overton window. It's recognizing where the Overton window is and then marching it to the right. And being very careful because there will always be an Overton window of some kind, and you just have to take it and you just march it rightward. And you have to do that. You can't break or completely crack an Overton window because a new one emerges. So getting control of the Overton window and being the people who get to decide where the Overton window is the kind of thing that I think we're looking for. And in Saskatchewan, the Sask Party absolutely sets the Overton window. Canada is a different ballgame, and the United States will be a different ballgame again. But to the point, to get back to the NETTR thing, I think, we don't want to just be winning within the terms that the left allows, but none of that implies that we have to just accept everything, or that we have to turn a blind eye to certain forms of evil, or that we have to play nice with people who hold views that are repugnant to us. I don't think that we have to do that. I don't think that we have to compromise for power. And I'm going to bounce pretty quick because I've got some things to take care of too, but I'll give a chance for someone to give a response to that so I'm not just hitting and running.
Sure. Mr. 8th century woodchipper, go for it, and then if you've got time, we'll do yellow.
Cool. Well, yeah, I mean, Wokal's talking about, how America and Canada are different contexts, and I would say, absolutely. I mean, the principle at play here is the question, though. But I mean, in America, take the issue of immigration. For 50 years, it's a topic that was verboten. And if you made that a core part of your political strategy, you would be rooted out of the Republican Party. You'd be rooted out of conservative Inc. And then in 2015, a guy gets on TV and says Mexico is bringing drugs and murderers and rapists, and some I assume are good people, right? And gets more votes than any Republican ever in history, because he said something that everyone knew, everyone recognizes, but was completely verboten to say because of the principle, well, I view these things as repugnant, right? I view anti-immigration as repugnant and racist. And because he said it out loud, it won. It was a huge winner, and it still is a huge winner. And so I just look at that. It's like, okay, yeah, you see where the Overton window is. That's true, but you certainly can break out of it, and you have to break out with, I mean, where those boundaries are. The people in charge of punditry and everything else will say these things are repugnant and bad, but guess what? They're not, and the populace doesn't agree with you. And so, I mean, it's the same thing like the situation in Canada, right? Like, if you have nominal power, it's great, you can abolish strip clubs, but if you are not allowed to talk about abortion and you're not allowed to talk about homosexuality and all of these other things, even though the populace, right, is against these things, these are big issues to people, then what is it? I mean, right now, this is a huge issue within the Republican Party after Roe versus Wade ended, that now we're not allowed to talk about abortion because, right, that'll cost us elections. And I mean, I get the idea. Okay, you want to practice some strategy, you do want to win elections, but at certain level, you have to say things that people are going to view as repugnant, and saying that, that abortion is the murder of children is repugnant to people. But we saw this like the other day. Tucker Carlson goes on stage and says, "This is child sacrifice. This is evil," right? And he's saying things that people need to hear and should hear. So I don't know. Like I just think I think this is repugnant line. Well, some things are going to be repugnant now, and they're not going to be in 5 years. So I take that for what you will.
I think, just to do a quick response, the abortion thing, I don't think so. I was there in those meetings for those decisions. The abortion thing was more had to do with the fact that the Saskatchewan Party has no jurisdiction over abortion in Canada at all. And so there's nothing to be gained by talking about it. There's nothing to be... You could conceivably lose some people by talking about it, but the people who agree that abortion is murder are already voting for us. And so I think that it was just, look, we have nothing to gain by talking about this, and the fact of it is we have no power over it. In terms of in the province of Saskatchewan, the regulations that we've been able to pass in terms of abortion, I don't think you can get an abortion in Saskatchewan after 18 weeks. That's impossible. That's as much as can be done by the provincial party is what can be done. Nothing else can be done. So I think that was more of a strategic thing rather than a point about repugnance. To your point about sometimes we have to say things which are going to offend people, like saying, for example, homosexuality is a sin or unfettered immigration is morally bad. I actually think that you're right about that. And I actually agree with you that at some point we're going to say things that are offensive to people because they're true. And I agree that needs to happen. But my point is not that we don't do things to offend people, or that we do or don't do things to offend people. My point is whether it offends people or not, we say them, but that doesn't prevent us from gatekeeping against genuine evil that comes from our own side. It's not that I'm saying we need to make a purely political decision with respect to how we can get elected, so we have to cancel people that might lose us votes. What I'm saying is genuinely bad people, cynical operators, people with evil ideas, those sorts of individuals who are are genuinely evil, we need, or that we hold to have genuinely repugnant views to us as the right, need to be removed. I don't know why in 2016 the Republicans had Caitlyn Jenner on stage. Right, that's an example going to the left, against the left, but it's that sort of thing. We have to establish the borders of our movement to get along the lines of truth, not mere expedience. And we can do, and within that, we can still be strategic, but our strategic options are going to kind of be limited by our commitment to truth. But I think that's okay, because if you trade truth for power, you lose both. So I'll let someone else respond to that, and then I'm going to head out here. But again, thank you for having me, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Lantern, you've had your hand up for like about 30 minutes now. I do want to let you speak. Dave, I think you and Wokal have had your tete-a-tete for quite some time now, but Mr. Lantern, go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry for the So, Mr. Wokal, I see what your point. You have, I will admit, you have made a lot of good progress regarding, the political situation in your province. But you also have to think about the long-term thing, because you can't just win in elections and stuff. Because, eventually, like I said, mass immigration, no country recovers from their own government essentially replacing the state constituting population that made the country what it is. And so we see this also, and that's a point up raising, is that the reason these taboos they become unacceptable is because the adversaries, they control the basically the media state section apparatus, which I'm not even sure I can even call it the cathedral anymore, considering we have proof that essentially various departments of like the state governments or the federals just basically give orders to all these companies and all these media programs to say, this is the narrative, this is the line, you can and cannot say that. So I'm not even sure we live in that kind of decentralized, atheistic kind of theocratic form. But I also want to get to the point, like, I think another point that was missed a lot is the difference between criticism and cancellation, and what exactly we mean by the cancellation. So when someone undergoes an institutional, essentially they're depriving someone in a way of basically, unofficially depriving them of their ability for property, for the ability to make a living, to stuff. It's essentially, take what has happened to Russell Brand. I haven't listened to his content, but you see the letter when you see like the Bank of England or the UK government essentially forcing a company or forcing the banks to essentially kick this guy off the platform, despite the fact that he's only just been accused of crimes and misconducts. He's not even been trial. It's just guilt until proven innocence. And when I see something like that as an evil value, you have to understand there is a difference between what we see as good and evil. For me, not just from the Christian beliefs that I believe in, but you can tell something is evil is when you take something good and you invert it. So right now you're taking the innocence of you have innocent until proven guilty. Now it's evil because it's now guilty until proven innocent. So, and there's, that's one example of a cancellation. And another form of like a criticism we have is like, take the recent BAP article that's covering, the rise of Javier Milei and how his criticism was directed at the economic sort of populists or the Bannonites, saying that, listen, the reason his arrival as a populist is because the populist movement never happened in Argentina. They had decades of this type of Peronist economic discourse, things that basically wrecked the country. What we need is not like more of this intervention. You need to take people's boots off their necks. And part of the reason that you see a lot of the, you questioned, why does Caitlyn Jenner why does she have a presence? Why are all these people loud? Well, simply because in the United States, freedom of association was effectively abolished with civil rights law, because it assumed, we made it a mission to root out all forms of discrimination. It's been framed as the ultimate evil. Or, you see, what government sees as theological or theocratic, because remember, neutrality is a farce. When you see these theological and theocratic positions, you can see a lot of what causes people to go haywire and cause this radicalism that only pulls the discourse in one direction. For example, we see, speaking of Canada, you had them giving a speech to a member who was part of the Galician Waffen SS division, which, depending on whether or not you believe this person is Nazi, but for the West, much of the discourse and theology has been framed on the idea that, where anti-fascism is the state ideology of the West, set by the precedents in the 1930s to 40s of both the United States and Soviet Union's idea of government. So that's the value system behind, there is no neutrality. So when you see that combined with, calling everyone a Nazi while giving stuff, it's not hypocrisy, it's the hierarchy. They don't care about the values of what the people used to think or what stuff. They'll treat your enemies like, because it's a flex. They want to show you have power. So power and truth are not actually antagonistic. There's great power in how people see truth. Because actually what you're not actually describing as power, you're describing force. There is a difference between force and power. And force is when you apply and try to make it something, like make something good, make something bad. Whereas power and truth, it compels people. Like, we know something is true because, well, it works. It can work in a sense of keeping someone in line and stuff. And that's kind of like where you see a lot of people saying, you have to not only get past the election stuff, but you also have to, look at what else is happening. Like, it's good that you've banned strip clubs. It's good that you stuff, but look at the broader picture. Who's to say the Canadian government won't do what they did to the Quebecis and essentially import non-Quebecis to vote in the referendum when it came to their independence? You have to really, in the age of
You might want to
mass
wrap it up.
sorry, I'm rambling. But yeah, I see what your point. Like, it can't just be in the realm of the political. Spiritual and cultural changes are needed in order to facilitate the kind of change. And some institutions, for example, are not going to be long march through. They're designed specifically to counter against infiltration. So the best way, what you do is not only you can build up your own institutions, but you can also delegitimize and knock over the old ones. Dave the Distributors had a good point about universities. How do we solve the problem of all the overproduce? Well, make them swallow the debt, make them liable for all the debt, and then when it comes time for the government knock, liquidate the departments, clear out all the clutter, close them down. Tell these professors that all these woke studies, you guys are all frauds and imposters. Go. You'll find better work as a sanitation department. But those are just stuff like, my point is, like, there's a difference between force and power and truth and untruth, and it's not just in the political realms. You can battle. Think locally and act locally when you can, but also look at the big broader picture of your society at large. Sorry, that's all I got to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, I appreciate that. I didn't want to hit and run, but I do have to run now. But thank you for having me, and I appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you for coming on. I appreciate that. All right, well, there's quite a few people that have requested to speak. I'm going to probably just go through the lines. Meta, go ahead and get some. Actually, no, Meta, you've been here for a while. WSB, White Boy Summer Apparel, you're up.
Hey, guys. It's my first Twitter space. Thanks for having me, Mr. P. And we were discussing earlier about building parallel structures, building businesses. Me and my business partners are building this from scratch. And just to give you guys a little overview of what our goals are, we're trying to provide high quality apparel in the right wing sphere. As you guys have probably noticed, most stuff's drop shift. It's low effort. It's fulfilled by third parties. We do all the labor. I'm professionally trained in photography. I'm really putting in a lot of work with this stuff. And we're trying to, and everyone always complains, oh, we need to do art. We need to do this. So we're trying to get some kind of artistic thing building in the sphere. So we're canvassing for different right-wing artists, etc. We've got a lot of cool ads coming up in smaller podcasts like Astroflights next month, and we got our first apparel deal with the Good Old Boys. Will be manufacturing their merch. And yeah, if you guys have any smaller podcasts you can throw our way, we'd really appreciate it in terms of just looking to advertise. And we're not looking for charity. We will pay you guys for advertisement. I know a lot of people have not figured out monetization yet, so it's kind of a win-win if anyone in the sphere wants to have their own merch manufactured. We're on a profit share model, or we can just advertise on podcasts with our own paid ads on different podcasts. And I'm Max Teller. I am the Chief Marketing Officer of WBS Apparel. Thank you, guys.
To open
I
up
didn't
your
expect us
DMs to people who don't follow you. Just a heads up.
Yeah, be sure to do that. But let's get
Our
back to the
DMs
main
are
subject at hand.
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, it's so bad that Wokal left because I wanted to ask him, like, one very simple question. And I think his answer would be quite surprising as opposed to most people in the space, which is he keeps saying, like, us in the political right, us in the political right. But what does Wokal distance mean by the political right? That's, like, the one question I wanted to ask him. And I wonder what his answer would be. Because I think, like, that definition is something that we keep going over. Like, certainly we've gone over and over again. But I just have this slight suspicion that his answer to that would influence the way you think about a concept like, no enemies to the right. And I think, like, that's a very important one. And it's a shame that he left because, it would have been very interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the important things on that sort of what do we mean the right, and this is where I will casually shill a video that Dave Green has made years ago that I think is aged like a fine wine, which is to be right wing in 9 points. It's on his YouTube channel. I think that offers a pretty good definition for what we mean on the right. I think that there's got to be, that teleological grounding that we're doing something that our progeny will appreciate, that we're trying to make the world a better place in that respect. I've said that myself. I want to make sure that whatever I do, whether it's in my writing or my IRL political work that I do, that you want to ensure that I can plant the vine and fig tree my grandchildren will sit under and not be afraid. Whether I get to see it or not is besides the point. But yeah, I mean, also the scalability of what he's discussing. Canada has the population size as an entire country of roughly 38 million people, millions of which have only come in the last 5 to 6 years. But they're roughly the size of population equivalent to the state of Texas in the United States. California has more people that live in that state than the entire population of Canada. Saskatchewan as a province has roughly 1.12 million people. I think that there's some issues about how you translate that scale over. I get what he was saying about abortion and that, there's only so much that you can do as a province to legislate that. But I mean, even in Texas, right? Like the state of Texas has wanted drag shows banned, and a federal court said, no, you can't do that, despite the fact that I don't think that decision from that federal court had any authority whatsoever. And I mean, I would also say that there's a long history of American officials ignoring those things. And I think that you shouldn't want to cancel someone for saying, no, screw you, I'm still going to ban drag shows that expose genitals to kids. Like, I think that that's perfectly fine. But again, I think scalability is a huge issue. And again, like, there's nice things to say, but what can I do about playing? And I get the optics game. I do. I have issues with it. Lord knows that I do. It's why some things I write about or talk about are on Odyssey and not on YouTube. But at the same time, I get that there's a political way to do things, that you want to ban things such as like strip clubs or liquor stores or whatever. But it's a little hard to maintain that political capability when, for instance, in my state, they're happily, joyously overflowing, Democrats and leftists alike, about the millions of people that are pouring in that are meant to dilute and replace political power that someone like me has. And I think that that's something that cannot be overstated about no enemies to the right. It's like, well, if someone to my right, or even someone that I consider pretty on par with what I believe in, says something like, immigration is an existential issue, yeah, I kind of want that guy on my side. And I don't think that I would want to join in with David Frum or the Bulwark or even James Lindsay canceling that guy for being an extremist or him being called a Nazi. Those are some important things to contextualize in this sort of discussion. But Meta, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to quickly say, I think some people were talking about how, being bombastic has, look at all the examples of how this has worked, right? Look at like Trump and what he said, and look at, and I think goes back to the point that I was making earlier, is all of these decisions need to be made and considered in the context in which they happen, right? Like Trump is a very unique situation, right? And to say that, hey, because Trump can go out and say these things and it worked for him, this is a strategy that we should apply wholesale. I think that's just a little too much for me. I think everything needs to be considered. And so, certainly at local levels, you can be a lot more aggressive, especially if you have the local support and the backing and the ability to do so. Like, sure, why not, right? Take the ground that you can take when you can take it. But to say well, we've done that here, and so therefore we should do this everywhere. I think that that's not an extrapolation that you can make effectively.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think that you really can't have. There's not a lot of equivalency that can be drawn from, say, what's happening with Saskatchewan and say what's happening in New York City or the federal level. I mean, it's just very hard, I think, to translate that over and to make that an equitable comparison. I mean, if Wokal wants to lead the charge and say, ban strip clubs, ban abortion, do whatever in Canada, and like oust Justin Trudeau, the bastard child of Fidel Castro, I would support Wokal 100% because Wokal would probably be a lot better of a political leader or strategist than Justin Trudeau is. But neither here nor there. I just think that that's an issue there. There have been some couple of speakers that have come on in, some mutuals, some new people. So I guess we'll just go with one of my favorite sort of Star Trek accounts. If you want to go, Mr. Ducat, go for it. If not, I'll probably just
thank you. I'm grateful to be on the stage with so many great people. One thing I wanted to point out, and I listened to the entirety of the Dave and Wokal stream. Whether that was a good idea or not, I leave to the audience. But one thing that Dave mentioned that I just wanted to point out, and I wish Wokal was here, and I would have pointed it out during the debate, is we have to understand that there are collateral damages to what we do sometimes as well. Like, I mean, ultimately, the one thing I was disappointed in the debate is they didn't mention Thomas Accord. Because, I mean, this whole thing, when they mention Rod Dreher and they mention all these things, it all centers around the Accord affair. And the thing that Dave mentioned in the debate that I didn't know, I knew all the particulars. At least I thought I knew all the particulars of the Accord affair. But the one thing that I didn't know is it was more than Thomas that was targeted here. That the staff, the administration of the school went to people who were favorable towards Accord and said, will you denounce him? Will you denounce nationalism? And they said no, and they fired them. So the idea that you could just target one unsavory individual and that would be it, and let's pretend that he was evil and he deserved to go. Did those people deserve to go? Like, what's the limiting principle here? You have to understand that these institutions, even a Christian school, could be captured by your enemies. And so if you give them, your enemies, an opportunity to take this guy down here, they'll happily take down his friends too.
Yeah, that's the big thing that never gets addressed in there. And we're not, Dave and I are not going to name names because we both know who that person is personally. But again, I think that it's very important to remember, like, and I said this earlier in this space, and I've said it prior in other shows and appearances, that when it comes to these matters, it's never just one individual. It's never just one evil, nasty bigot or whatever they want to call them, because they'll go after their supporters. They'll go after any person that they associated with. Like, I feel like we've been the NETTR debate. It feels like a big rehash of things that we've already learned in the past since 2016. Like, what came during that election cycle also came the data and society sort of network map of every like alt-right or not, or even conservative liberals that were just like, hey, this SJW stuff's gone too far. And so they were associating like all sorts of YouTubers that maybe had one appearance or commented or reposted a video that someone else did. And that's how they managed to get a hold of like the adpocalypse stuff. That's how they managed to get a lot of people banned off YouTube, throttle their growth. I mean, my friend Semyagog has been a mutual of many people in here. He was on that early list and his growth just died right afterwards. And so he's been consistently more or less at the same subscriber count he's been at since like 2017. It's never just one person. It's never just one organization, because if they deem them to be outside the Overton window, anyone who's remotely close to it is next on the target list. And we've seen this time and time again with people that we may disagree with, people that we may assume to be feds or whatever. Like, it happens that way. And even if and this is why, again, I think, OPSEC is important. This is why, if you're going to stay anonymous, you've got to be extra careful about this. We saw this with a few of our Twitter account mutuals and things like that past, where, they wrote something, and it also happened to be very similar to what this person tweeted. They make connections and doxing happens. And so you got to defend these people in the same way that you understand it's never just one person. It always goes after a group. They will be inquisitorious about it. They'll go after you in any which way they can. And at the end of the day, whether it's about criticisms or cancellation, I do think perhaps no canceling to the right is a better idea. And this is why, in that debate, there's a reason why, William F. Buckley Jr. got called Judas in the writings of Charles Haywood, because you look at the history, of what Buckley had no problem when the ADL or other leftist organizations and other individuals with ethnic grievances went after the John Birch Society, or more recently in recent history, Samuel T. Francis and all that happening with his decision to speak at American Renaissance. Doesn't matter, but he got canceled. He got sacked in the same way that great thinkers like Joseph Sobran for his opinions on, say, the nation of Israel and the issue of our foreign policy. Now, the guy's a traditionalist Catholic. He's probably not going to have the world's most positive opinion on our foreign aid to that country. Nevertheless, they went after him. He got canceled, and no one really cared. And that's been this sort of ongoing trend about the history of sort of the more mainstream right, because they have no problem if the quote unquote fringes get canceled. We get to stick to our principles, and we get to be the very beautiful losers that Sam Francis described us to be as. And I think that that's an important thing to consider in this NETTR debate is that all the things that those guys talked about, 50 to 5 years ago, and their cancellations, even like John Derbyshire, a lot of that stuff is still true. And a lot of that stuff is still being discussed today because those issues never got addressed. And I think that that's kind of important. And I'll leave it there, but I am going to let Kellogg go and then Nightmare Visions up.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, just complete newbie to whatever this NETTR space is. But I was in the last space and carried over here, and very refreshing, to say the least. Just as I'm as kind of a Southern raised Christian, kind of coming back to Christianity and conservative values here recently with the development of my family. I'm just so stoked to see that there are other people out here that are thinking like me. Sorry if that's kind of silly, but it's a big deal. So I appreciate y'all being here and the opportunity to speak. Anyways, so one kind of question that I did have is just in terms of corpo world speak, I know there is some kind of value in doing things like a hiring freeze and stuff like that to be able to let your culture develop within a company and not grow too fast, sort of a thing, because then you end up kind of losing control of it to sort of outside forces that take advantage of it. I do understand that Trump in 2015 was able to shatter kind of that Overton window, so he didn't have to operate within it. But I think that's kind of a rarity, and I think that for a lot of us, for me, operating on a non account, there's a lot of things that kind of come into your mind, and you have to operate I don't know, I personally, I switched to an actual account because I'm just tired of the bullshit and I just want to make a stand. But you see the way that even today, they're people will go out and destroy you and everything that you've worked towards and stuff. So I have a couple of questions. So what is NETTR? Can somebody send me a good reference to something I can look at? B, how do you actually kind of make a stand within your own local space? And then to be able to make a difference or be able to hopefully make some kind of convert. And then other than that, y'all are awesome, and I just appreciate the chance to be up here. Cheers.
All right, Kellogg, I'm going to run through this quickly. My DMs are should be open. If not, I will at you and I'll send you some resources if you can't look them up as I go through them. One, NETTR means no enemies to the right. This has sort of been a concept pushed by Charles Haywood. You can find him here on Twitter and his own website called theworthyhouse.com. He first wrote an essay there, sort of, and then it's also been fleshed out in I Am 1776, which is a magazine, where he has this conversation about no enemies to the right with their editor, Daniel Miller. It's been a subject of debate now for about a year and a half, so that's probably a good place for you to get started, is to read Charles's own words and the responses that have come from it. Secondly, as for getting involved, it's going to vary based on where you live, but you kind of have to start with your own local existing institutions. So, I mean, presumably, given by your voice, you sound like you're from America, you said you're from the South. You have to be aware of what positions and offices hold power. So places like your city council, but most importantly, when it comes to money, your county commissioners, and of course, working locally within your own party, your local GOP for your county or whatever is a good place to get started. Your networking, get those ideas out of the way and start understanding who you are. And also, do you trust your neighbor? Are you a good example in your community? There's a lot of work that goes behind it, but the payoff is immense in the ability to wield power. And as for the last point, thank you. And we'll try and keep the conversation going, but I'll at you later with more resources if you can't look that up, but I'm going to move the discussion along real quick. Mr. Nightmare Vision, thank you for bringing your owlish visage over on to the space.
Okay, thanks for saying that. I hope you don't regret it once I start talking.
It's recorded, Nightmare Vision. It's not Night Owls. Okay, please.
Listen. Okay, thank you for reminding me. Okay,
Yeah.
So let me just I listened to it. This has been going on for a long time, but I did listen to most of the debate, and I've been kind of in and out of this thing. But it's been a good space so far from what I've heard. But why is Wokal distance being included in these things? Joe Rogan follows him. He has a bunch of people who follow him, but he just pretends to be this good faith actor. But you guys have seen this dude's Twitter threads. He's just a complete clown, just a totally unserious person who's always over the top and hysterical. And it's obvious, they were having this really abstract debate, over the principle of no enemies to the right. But it was that's kind of beside the point. You know what I mean? Because that people like Wokal Distance and James Lindsay and all these people that have pretty much totally outlived their usefulness, but have built up these huge followings, regarding kind of center right media, what they mean when they use that term. They want to just gatekeep people. And one of the, especially with Wokal, these guys basically pretend that all criticism is bad faith. So someone will just be like, hey, James Lindsay, have you actually read Hegel, or are you just retarded and just spouting a bunch of bullshit that's totally divorced from reality? And he'll just be like, oh, these groypers, blah, blah, blah. And same thing with Wokal Distance. He'll do this huge thread where Oliver Anthony is a sign of some sort of neo-Christian renaissance, just the most ridiculous, Giga Chad dialogues have more intellectual rigor and pedigree than the writings of Wokal Distance and James Lindsay. And yet they stand there they want to participate in this discussion as if they don't have this deeply invested interest in being able to control what people say and kind of maintain their clout, so to speak. But it's totally undeserving. Wokal Distance is a relic of Gamergate, and not one of the good ones. There's lots of people that are kind of actually, now that I think about it, most of the relics of Gamergate are pretty useless at this point. They're mostly counterproductive. But I don't know. I just kind of found the whole abstract nature of the debate incredibly tedious. It was boring as shit, and no one was just getting directly to the heart of the matter. That's half of these people, the other guy too, the Indian, who was kept talking about how much he loves Jesus, and how it was the same thing. The moral scolding was just from both of these guys. Wokal sounded like he was about to cry. Basically, every time he opened his mouth, he sounded like he was holding back tears, and he kept calling everybody evil. And what was the analogy he kept using? I was laughing so hard. It was
diseased minds.
No, it was the dough. It was you're the yeast in the dough. I can't remember. It was so deeply retarded, and I was laughing because again, it was just no one was just asking straight up okay, so do you want all Western countries to be brown? or not? Like, if not, then like, what are we talking about? And like, you notice that like they were very intent on not having these kind of like these direct questions. And it's the same thing with Trump. Like I looked through some of these guys' Twitters, and they have this like complete effeminate, over the top, hysterical commentary regarding Donald Trump. And so they're like sitting there talking about like no enemies to the right, as if it's this like, you know, really abstract philosophical conversation. But like, they think Donald Trump is too far. Like how do you have an honest discussion on the quote unquote right with people that think like Donald Trump is like a bridge too far? So the whole thing is like, it's a little bit ridiculous, because they're not like, half of these guys weren't really interested in answering the question. And the only other thing I wanted to say was regarding that Indian guy. Wokal was kind of doing it too, but everyone kept talking about Christianity, and people have been talking about Christianity in this space too. Like I kind of have a negative take, especially after listening to that. Like those guys, especially the one guy, it was such a poor reflection on being a Christian in these types of spaces. Because if you're like a young guy and you're like, okay, like prove to me that you're not just going to cynically use this religion to like morally scold people to kind of like keep them in line and reinforce totally libtarded norms. Like the way he was talking was like, well, I'm a Christian, and anyone to my right is like a rapist serial murderer, and I'm going to stand against them. And it's like, whoa, like, what are you talking about? Like, obviously,
Franco went too far, man. He went too far when they murdered nuns. Like,
yeah, and it's like, yeah, and it's like, so, like, it was incredibly cynical. So, in other words, like, now before you even like get off the ground with the discussion, you're basically conceding that like your opponents are the people that have like a total monopoly on like morality or Christianity or whatever. And it's like, who has time for that? Like, I'd rather just get yelled at by like an MSNBC journalist rather than some like effete evangelical talking about how like, well, I don't know about you, but I serve the cross of Christ. Like, shut the fuck up, man. Like, who talks like that? What do you want, drugs? And so it's like, they don't want to address direct issues. They don't want to address direct questions. And so I found like the whole thing it kind of was in bad faith. But I think Haywood did pretty good. Like, I don't really pay too much attention to Haywood, but he seemed to kind of like get it. I get the general impression from him that like he kind of understood that the other two guys were complete clowns, but he was being,
he gets
respectful.
It out of all of he gets it out of all of them. I would say. I mean, Nate, I'm not Nate. I mean, Charles just casually fed posts in his book reviews. Like, just go read his like, I think it's his like Rhodesian like SAS manual, and he's just like, yeah, you need to do all these things because they're coming to kill you. But no, I agree wholeheartedly.
When Wokal, he said that like, I'm assuming Richard Spencer is opposed to wokeness. That was pretty funny. I gotta admit.
That was again. It was like, what fucking year is this? Like, pardon me for my language, but that was one of the biggest issues I had with this entire discussion. Was this just like, are we really reiterating? And I mentioned this earlier, Nightmare. I don't know if you were here, but it's like that Thermidor Magazine podcast you were linked to yesterday or the other day on Night Owls. I listened to it, and I was just like, holy shit, we're reiterating the same points about like optics and abstract ideas that like Cantbot and Ryan were talking about like, almost 7 years ago. Like, what are we doing? And it's this wild ride where it's no one wants to address the issue. And then you have, and what the whole other freaking elephant in the closet here is that you have this whole other group of people that are like, actually, no, like America wants to overcome this. It needs to just accept the Browning and talk about class. And it's like, no, it's not it. Because everyone knows that, and they even talked about it, and they skirted around it so fast because they were so afraid to talk about it. Last I checked, Gio, that the third rail of American politics is race. And no one wants to talk about how the fact that this is like, they're importing millions, and they have no problem putting them in the whitest cities and the whitest states in America. But like, here we are.
No, but I was going to say, like, the meta of Wokal's analysis, okay, because I'm a Leaf, but this applies to Americans. Like, the meta of his analysis is that you have to, like, curate and shed certain elements of the right to have, like, a coherent political party to take positions. But you know who, like, was the master of this in Canada? Who, like, ruled with an iron fist and who cultivated everything to his whim? Stephen Harper, okay, and he destroyed like the reform conservative wing of the Conservative Party, and so I think like Wokal in the one sense he's trying to say truth is above power, but if we want to gain power, we have to basically shed ourselves of anything, like any principle. I mean, Stephen Harper did that, but on a national scale when he's talking about like the Saskatchewan party. And it's like very weird because like that's what you end up with. You end up with like Stephen Harper, who is like a neocon. He destroyed like any social conservatism. He banned MPs that would like dare talk about abortion or any like right-wing issue. He like bowed down to that one nation in the Middle East. Like it's, you know, it's like, yeah, you get Steve, and like, let's face it, compared to Trudeau, maybe he is better. Well, probably. But like at the end of the day, you still get Justin Trudeau. I'm sorry, Stephen Harper ruled with an iron fist. For what? You know, it's like the equivalent of being in Afghanistan for 20 years. It didn't matter at the end because the Afghanistan of 2023 looks exactly like the Afghanistan of 2001. It's like, yo, there you go. You had power. What did you do with it? But I don't know. So, but yeah, I fully endorse Nightmare Vision's take. It's 100% accurate.
Sure is.
Well, yeah, it's like this is obviously on a spectrum. You know what I mean? So like, you know, when they say no enemies to the right, that's kind of why I feel like you can't have that discussion like without respect to the particular content of how people are defining their terms. But of course, that would have just made it like a more long-winded, abstract discussion with like us being tortured by Wokal Distance having to define what he even means by like the right. You know what I mean? So it's like when people were using that, you know, Prudentialist, you brought up that podcast, when people were using, you know, slogans like no enemies to the right and stuff, the reason why that was all going through scrutiny in like 2017 was because, you know, like anyone who can remember, it was like you had really antisocial elements going public and they were embarrassing themselves and stuff like that. And everyone realized really quick that like this was going to be counterproductive. Your actual life was going to be jeopardized, your livelihood at the very least, right? Like, and it was just something that people who had their head on their shoulders decided that they just didn't want to be, you know, associating with in any capacity. Having that conversation now, it's like that element doesn't really exist. And so it's like, well, what, like, who's the enemy to the right, like of whom you speak? You know what I mean? It's like, then if you really get at that, you'll find that like some of these guys just mean like very basic right-wing opinions. Like some of the stuff that Trump ran on 2016, they just find completely abhorrent. And so it's like when they talk about like an enemy to the right, they're not talking about like a deeply antisocial movement in public, like a you know, like a march or a rally or something filled with like skinheads or some shit like that. Like they're just talking about people that have come to like reasoned conclusions that happen to be further to the right than they're comfortable with or they're being paid to believe in or something like that. And so, you know, I don't understand. It really kind of doesn't make sense to me how you can have a discussion about a concept like that without reference to the specific content of what people are advocating for.
And none of that was discussed at all in the entirety of that debate whatsoever about what does it mean. I mean, the only thing that was discussed is like, well, my objective is the total destruction of the left having power. And I was like, that's fine, but there's no definition of what the right was. It was very high concept, very abstract, kind of pointless because there were no definitions provided. But 8th Century Woodchipper, you're up, and then Meta. We're going to actually wrap up soon, so I'm going to let everyone get their last words in. So Woodchipper, you're up.
Yeah, let me go real quick here. I just want to speak to something that Nightmare Vision brought up. So like the context of the whole debate is within, you know, evangelical Christian circles. That, I mean, so much of it, he was in the space earlier. Stephen Wolfe wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism, and that freaked all of these regime evangelical types out. Where he's defining what a nation is, and he's basically laying forth the, you know, Reformed Protestant historic case for what a nation is, why mass immigration is bad, all this kind of stuff. And these people lost their minds. So like Neil and Wokal denounced him, and then that's the context of the whole Accord thing. Is Stephen and Thomas did a podcast together. That's why those people attacked Accord and doxed him and did all the things they did, because they wanted to get Stephen. And so that's like the backstory to this. And so, yeah, I'm sorry you had to be subjected to, you know, effeminate regime evangelical whining. But that's kind of where it comes from. And so, yeah, Haywood did a great job. Nate was good too in laying these things out, that these people don't know what time it is. They don't understand. I mean, Wokal yeah, I don't know. I mean, guys are speculate on this guy whether he's operating in good faith or not, but like a lot of people aren't, quite obviously. And so, yeah, it's like this conversation has to happen. But I really wish that Gio had been able to ask, what do you define as the right anyway? Just like being against abortion, or like anything more broad than that? Like, what is your view on immigration? Like he tiptoed around it a little bit, but like, no, mass migration is an intentional strategy to depopulate the country of white people. Like, that's obvious. That's the goal. And so is that bad? And what are you going to do to stop it? Are you going to say, oh, these bad people are racist, we got to stop them? Like, no, it's so ridiculous, and it is bad faith.
Well, just really quick, let me just address this too. Like, just to reiterate, you know, the one guy that kept draping himself in Christianity and really bad faith. I mean, obviously, when you're discussing like religion, Christianity, you know, you're obviously talking about morality, ethics, right and wrong. And this is why a lot of people on Twitter, a lot of the anons on Twitter don't even like bother with that shit. It's not that, well, I mean, at least from my perspective, right? It's not that like you don't sincerely believe in that distinction. It's that like, if you paid attention to even the way they were talking in the discussion of like no enemies to the right, like the one guy, the evangelical guy, and that's what I mean, Wokal too. I don't think he was doing it explicitly in Christian rhetoric like the other guy, but he was basically doing the same thing where they were acting like, you know, you have a gun to some little girl's head and you either like pull the trigger or your like wife dies of cancer. And they like put you in this like really weird scenario where like, if you're advocating for anything further to the right, you necessarily are evil and you're sacrificing all your moral principles. And this bleeds out into all the kind of conversations people have around BAP with like Ross Douthat and stuff. People come out with these terms, neo-pagan, Nietzsche, and blah, blah, blah. In other words, like there's this implicit assumption that if you believe in right and wrong, then rightness is just being like a modern American libtard. And so if you don't believe in that, you're like this joker moral nihilist who's just trying to blow up hospitals and burn schools to the ground and shit. And it's like, I don't understand how you could even have a conversation with one, let alone two people that basically buy into that and like ask you like, oh, well, if you're advocating positions that are further to the right than we happen to hold, right? You are necessarily like setting your Bible on fire and spitting in Jesus's face like a Pharisee. It's like, well, what if you don't agree with that? Like, I actually don't agree with that. I don't think that's right at all. So like, I'm not like, it shouldn't be incumbent upon you to argue like, well, actually in drastic times, you know, we need to start, you know, killing children and blowing up hospitals and doing all this like crazy extremist stuff. Like you just be like, no, I don't like, no, like having a border is not this like deep morally compromising scenario where like I'm up at night because I had to do this great evil in order to save my country. And I'm like, you know, I'm this like devilish hero who like my own soul is condemned. You know, it's like, no, I don't believe in that entire frame. And so it's like, if you're not even going to entertain a discussion at that level, the rest of it, like I would just like from my own perspective, I would just like ignore the religious angle entirely. And that's where I would just resort to insulting these guys straight up. Cause it's like, it's too bad faith to even get off the ground.
Yeah, if this space weren't recorded, I'd probably have more harsh words to say on that front. But we're going to keep wrapping this up. Meta, you're up next.
Yeah. So real quick, I have 3 points that I've written down to kind of go off Nightmare's last point. You know, one of the problems that I see, and I made this kind of in long form, so I'll keep this one short, is that morality is not so much a set of rules, but it's an application of like philosophy and strategy. And so you have a lot of people who they can't think about how to kind of take general ideas and adapt them to certain situations. And so especially in the religious side, you know, people get really kind of militant about, oh, what defines morality is being kind and accepting and all of these kinds of things. And they can't think of a single scenario in which, you know, that could actually backfire. And so, yeah, you're just like, you're not talking to a person who, to use a wise man's words, understands, has a basic understanding of things like object permanence. So they're not really worth the conversation. The second point that I wanted to bring up is we're talking about where do we define the right and how should we define the right? And I've actually put a lot of thought into this because a lot of what I try to do on Twitter is create a common language that we can use to bridge the gaps between different groups, right? So meta philosophy, meta language. And One of those ideologies that I've come up with is the idea of naturalism, right? Like I think a lot of the ideas that we have on the right are grounded in this kind of natural objective truth that we're looking to implement strategies that are healthy for good societies that want to flourish and celebrate life. This all gives us also a lot of high ground in the sense that we can say, hey, look, like it is objectively better for you to be healthy and not fat, right? And so the idea that someone can argue that like fat is beautiful or whatever should be ridiculous on its face. And this is a good way of approaching this too, because one of the big problems that we have is thinking a lot of these things in the right left dichotomy. A lot of the ideas that come from the quote unquote right get rejected out hand. But I think that these are kind of universal values that if and we've talked about this before, that a lot of people out there, they don't want to mutilate their kids and neuter them. They don't want to kind of bring in lots of people over the border and stuff like that. And so if you can find this, and I think I've talked with a good amount of people about how do you bring a group together and the importance of kind of that shared ethos. And I think fundamentally it is this kind of natural grounding. And then the second piece is quality, that we are trying to celebrate higher culture, and that is quality above equality. And then the last thing I'll say is just, one of the things I kind of came into the Twitter sphere with was an appreciation for what I called a biodiversity of strategy. There's all types of people out here. There's all, they sit in different positions in the thought space. They have different approaches, strategies, right? And, I think that similarly to a healthy ecosystem, the more biodiversity you have, the more robust that system is. If there's some sort of change, and ideally that things that work well will then continue to propagate. And so I think similarly here, I don't, and so because of this, I don't begrudge people taking different strategical approaches to how they share their ideas or encapsulate their ideas. I think it's healthy to allow that space to exist. But I also think that in any kind of setting, if nature is going to kill something, you want it to be killed, right? You don't want something that's sickly, unhealthy, or ungood to exist. And so I think we should have that kind of room to allow different strategies, but we should also very much have the ability to kind of tear things down that don't work. So those are the points that I wanted to make.
No, I appreciate that greatly. Let's go with Kruptos and then Yellow, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, thanks, Prue. I very much agree with what Nightmare's saying too. At very salient points. One thing that I did want to emphasize, though, I think it's important for people to understand that there is, this NETTR discourse, running into, the whole Christian nationalist thing, right? And it runs into evangelical leaders who have a vested interest in things being as they are. And there's a large swath of evangelical Christianity that basically is like managerial Christians, and church growth movements. They're very systems oriented, and in that regard, even though for many their theological language is conservative, they do things like managers, right? And so they think like managers. And I think part of this space, that having been a pastor myself, you have to learn how to speak their language, because these folks wield an enormous amount of influence over people. And in many ways, it's enormous amount of influence for good. But at the same time, they don't see what time it is, and largely because they're sitting on top of successful ministries. So they look around and everything is successful and peachy keen, and they don't realize that there's another whole world out there where things are changing and people are losing their jobs, they're being canceled, and blah, 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 blah. But in order to convince them or work around them, you have to be able to talk to evangelicals in evangelical language, and you have to be able to frame your arguments in ways that make sense to Christians. That's one of the things that I do on my Substack, is try to frame things in a way that makes theological sense and brings a greater degree of theological sophistication than just quoting a few Bible verses and trying to take the high road, because there's a whole range of tradition that there's a general anti-intellectualism in the evangelical world. And so, I've long lamented take for example somebody like Michael Anton, who's phenomenal, quoting the classics, quoting Machiavelli, but you can't quote in the public sphere. You can't quote Moses or Paul in the public sphere, but you have to learn how to speak that language. And I think in many ways there's a lot of power in biblical passages if you do it properly, if you learn how to think theologically in a public square. And there's a lot of ground, like we talk about building coalitions and winning coalitions. Like, I mean, what is it? 35% of the American public are, regular evangelical churchgoers. So there's a huge constituency, and learning how to speak to them is very, very important, because many of these people are going to form the core of the resistance to the regime. And that's, I guess, my basic opinion is something that we need to learn how to do. And we need to learn how to talk to those that we got to get them off the high road to like a kind of Christian realism in that regard.
Yellow, you're up next.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I kind of wanted to hit on this sort of, wishy-washy argument Wokal was making, because, yeah, he frequently confused force with power. And I think one of the reasons that he struggled with no enemy to the right is because one of the spaces I remember, like one of the points repeatedly made on the Night Owls is that essentially the reason the cancel culture was because libs and all the stuff, they're never made to answer for all their continuous mistakes or their faux pas or all the crappy they do that drag down the quality of life and the human and social capital. They're just they pass the buck, where they just say, oh, we're just going to not talk about it and move on. But you're right. The point is that I think the reason is that, like, the way that Christianity's work, I mean, we saw an example, another near cancellation. Look what happened to Ryan Turnipseed, where, like, to him, like, when he makes a thread criticizing the catechism that the Lutheran Missouri Church was going to put out, it resulted in him. I mean, not only did they not change it despite feedback, they start accusing them all of like fascists. They pull sources from Antifa and enemies of the church to try to dox these people, to do all these things. I mean, there is a lot of things to go over, and yeah, I think like a lot of people just, they don't read the room because of the intense amount of propaganda. I mean, for heaven's sakes, a McDonald's ad from Japan brings out the absolute worst in all of these people because they just can't stomach the idea that there's just normal people. Now, granted, of course, McDonald's here nowadays is crappy because the ice machines are always broken, and now they're taking away the kiosks because, the demographic we're not allowed to talk about is, well, not being held accountable for the actions of that, but I digress. But it is just, like, yeah, these people just don't really see that the danger is already here when they always think about persecution. Persecution has already happened. Look at Ricky Vaughn. Look at the January 6th protesters. Look at the political. I mean, we're at the point where, these people were always told are like, oh, blacks are always afraid of being shot. Like, look at what's happening on the videos. Look what's happening in Philadelphia right now. They're rioting in that street over in Conviction, and they're getting off the hook for killing people because of, de facto jury nullification based on the racial angle. I mean, it's the same type of thing when you look at, like, not to toot my own horn, but like I put together Nightmare Vision's thread on like his excerpts from Invisible Empire. And one of the points that he points out, that he's made is that like a lot of this history and frame is distorted because of how strong the racial politics. It's like a black hole that, well, pun intended or pun not intended, that just distorts the light. Every principle that plank and principle that conservatives have stood for has just been flagrantly and openly violated, but they're manipulated to believe that it was a good thing because it happened to a demographic that they think deserved it, whether it's, Southerners, whether, people they call Democrats. I mean, you see this stupid nastiness where, whenever they destroy statues to, Confederate soldiers or stuff, they'll just say, oh, it's just Dems taking down their own statues. I'm like, no, you idiot. That's not the reason why they're doing that. They want to, they want to kill people. They want to hurt people. And they do this by making them rootless. So when the Interahamwe mobs are formed by the liberals come the next election or whenever, they have the momentum and the force to make it happen. Sorry, a little bit of a rant, but you can see where like this incredulous line of argument comes from. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, honestly, to maybe wrap this whole debate up very quickly, Gio, you'll
By the
also
way,
get to
watch my
speak.
video on the McDonald's Japan commercial. It's in my pin tweet.
There you go. But I mean, I think Gio and I will cover this on Thursday on the Digital Archipelago, the show that he and I run. But I think it's like, honestly, this whole debate is almost as if you had someone from the Birchers trying to like own rhetorically William F. Buckley, who still gets invited to all these conferences and still gets all the high rolling deals while you don't. I mean, let's not kid ourselves here. Like, James Lindsay is a new atheist that hates Christianity, hates everything that you believe in, but that guy gets invited to the TPUSA pastors' conferences. Like, this is the shit you have to deal with. And yeah, they're not in good faith. And Nightmare Vision's correct on that. Like, we're dealing with absolute morons. And trying to own them rhetorically, or the whole debate me bro thing, I don't think it's going to work out. Acknowledge that they don't act in good faith, ridicule, and do your own thing and build ahead of them. I mean, they don't have to be included once you gain more capital and power and success. But Gio, final thoughts, and we'll wrap it up there.
Well, it's great. I see a lot of heavy shooters in the space. That's really, a lot of great posters. I think like this really, to quote my good friend and Julius, okay, the battlefield of ideas has been showered with the white phosphorus of truth. And I think, I think eventually those ideas will shine through. And next year is going to be, in my opinion, and this could be a little bit of a black pill, next year will be a huge test for this thing of ours, or the online right wing, whether we can stay together and form a cohesive unit. And who knows what's going to happen with the election and so forth, or if the election's even going to matter, right? But this, this whole debate, like you were mentioning, Prudentialist, has been reverberated. If you're an old head, you've seen this before, and you've seen the cycles of discourse that have happened in terms of forming something that is cohesive, that can have political change in the absence of actual immaterial political power. And those are always issues that we're going to have to deal with. And a lot of it's not going to be done by these various copes. And I hate it, I say this, as a Catholic myself, right? But, the critique of like subletting forms of baseness towards religion in the contemporary environment isn't going to really cut it. Because they're like, as much as our faith informs things, at the end of the day, there's, real world political problems that aren't going to be addressed. Like even the language, that Wokal and the other guy were using, that Nightmare Vision pointed out. There's a lot of Christians, a lot of serious people, like the person to the left of me or right of me, depending on the angle. 18th century wood chipper, like he's written a serious book about how you address this problem of Christianity in the modern world and contemporary North American West, in terms of political action, right? Now, and that is a big problem that you have to address. And I hate to say it, but a lot of like religious trads do have this fantasy where they can revert to an older social understanding towards religion, Christianity in particular. And that's not going to cut it, unfortunately. It's not that the truth of our religion is any different. It's just that the way that truth is disseminated in society is very different in 2023 than opposed to 1953. And, we have to deal with that. And we have to deal with the fact that, demographic change is going to be the main issue that determines a lot of things in terms of the social, cultural, racial understanding even that we have among people in I'm talking from the North American perspective. But, unfortunately, we've given voice to people that have given nothing but half or partial solutions. And the reason that they've given half or partial solutions, and I'm not advocating like violence or whatever, of course, I'm saying politically. The reason is because they have certain forms of either their identity or their belief that is deeply morally invested in hindering a lot of huge swaths of the right wing, in a contemporary context. And I think, like you mentioned, like James Lindsay, I mean, the fact that that guy is the figurehead of anything, quote unquote, on the right, like really just says it all, right? And we have to realize that there's a lot of deep psychological and, other issues, without being explicit, that a lot of these people have that prevent them from thinking with any clarity about what the definition of right wing is to begin with, but also how it is going to operate within a serious, political, real world polity context, right? A lot of what they say is juvenile. I hate to say it, a lot of what Wokal says is like total juvenilism. Like they're not really serious about anything, and because these people are invested in a discourse industrial complex that just endlessly replicates the same points. It's like the biggest, Nirvana to Wokal distance is going on Joe Rogan, really, honestly, and to James Lindsay. But that's the discourse industrial complex will condemn any form of action, like on the ground more than anything, if that makes sense. I don't know if thumbs up if I'm making sense to everybody.
You are. But with that, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I feel like these discussions are probably not going to go away anytime soon, just because there's going to be so much more discussions like this from more face posting people. Let's not kid ourselves. This will probably go on for a while as things progressively get worse. I do want to thank all of the speakers in here. If you're not following Nightmare Vision, Geo, Yellow Lantern, or Meta, or 8th Century Woodchipper, or WBS Apparel, by all means, please do so. Geo and I host a show over on YouTube and other platforms called The Digital Archipelago. We're live Thursdays at 2:15 p.m. Eastern. So if you're interested in that, by all means, tune on in. And once again, I thank you all for coming in and listening to all these various takes and some of the participators in that debate. And we'll see you all around next time. Take care, everyone.